Rome, in the 1st century before Christ, was not the mighty empire we imagine today. It was a republic crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Senators bickered in marble halls while outside. The streets echoed with unrest. Political corruption spread like wildfire. Generals built private armies more loyal to themselves than to the Senate. And the poor masses grew restless, desperate for change. This was the backdrop against which Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE. Caesar's family, the Iuli, claimed noble ancestry. They traced their line back to Aeneas, the Trojan hero, and through him to the goddess Venus herself. Yet, in reality, the Iuli of Caesar's generation were far from powerful. They held status but lacked wealth, caught between the aristocracy of Rome and the hard lives of common citizens. Caesar's father served as a relatively minor political figure, governing a small province in Asia. His mother, Aurelia, was a strong-willed woman from a more politically influential family. It was Aurelia who would shape much of Caesar's early character: discipline, ambition, and a sharp awareness of Roman politics. When Caesar was just 16, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving the young man the head of the household. Overnight, Caesar became responsible for the future of his family, his mother and his sisters. He was still a boy, but the burden of manhood was thrust upon his shoulders. It was a trial by fire, and Caesar, even then, showed resilience. The Rome of Caesar's youth was dominated by one man, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a ruthless general and politician. Sulla had seized power and declared himself dictator. His enemies were hunted down, their names written on public lists, their property confiscated, their lives ended with brutal efficiency. It was in this climate of fear and bloodshed that Caesar took his first steps into adulthood. Caesar's family had ties to the populace, the political faction that championed the rights of the common people. Sulla, on the other hand, was aligned with the Optimates, the conservative aristocrats who guarded their privileges fiercely. This made Caesar an immediate enemy in Sulla's eyes. The tension came to a head when Caesar married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's greatest rivals. To Sulla, this was an act of defiance. The dictator demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia. For a young man with no army, little wealth, and fragile political standing, refusal meant certain danger. Yet Caesar refused. He would not bow, not even to Rome's most feared tyrant. This decision nearly cost him his life. Sulla stripped Caesar of his inheritance, seized his wife's dowry, and sent soldiers after him. For months, Caesar lived on the run, moving from safe house to safe house, his health deteriorating under the strain. At one point, he was captured by Sulla's men. His fate seemed sealed. Yet, through bribery, persuasion, and perhaps sheer luck, he managed to escape. The experience marked him deeply. He had stared death in the face and survived. Later, when urged to pardon the young Caesar, Sulla reportedly warned, "In this boy, there are many Mariuses." It was a chilling prophecy, comparing Caesar to Gaius Marius, the populist general who had once nearly toppled the Republic. Even Sulla, in his ruthless clarity, saw in Caesar the seeds of greatness and danger. This period of exile and persecution forged Caesar's character. He learned to navigate treachery, to bend without breaking, and to use cunning when brute strength was not enough. He discovered that survival required both resilience and charm. Though only in his late teens, Caesar had already proven himself a man unwilling to compromise his values for safety. He was ambitious, and ambition in Rome was both a blessing and a curse. When Sulla eventually stepped down from his dictatorship and died in 78 BCE, Caesar could finally return to Rome. He had lost everything: wealth, connections, and political standing, but he had gained something far greater. Experience. He had tested the cruelty of Rome's politics firsthand. He had seen how power was taken, wielded, and lost. And above all, he had learned that Rome was ripe for a new kind of leader, someone bold enough to challenge the old order. The young Julius Caesar had survived his first trial by fire. The stage was set for his rise, though few could have imagined then that this fragile youth, once hunted and nearly killed, would one day reshape the Republic into an empire. After the fall of Sulla, Caesar cautiously returned to Rome. Though stripped of wealth and position, he still carried the name of the Julian name that opened some doors, even in difficult times. Yet he knew that survival alone would not guarantee greatness. To rise in the Roman world, one needed allies, reputation, and above all, proof of ability. For Caesar, the path forward began in the army. He joined a campaign in Asia Minor, far from the treacherous intrigues of the Roman Forum. Here, in the dust and blood of foreign lands, Caesar discovered a new stage on which to prove himself. During the siege of Mytilene, he displayed a reckless bravery that stunned his comrades. In the heat of battle, he fought with such ferocity that he was awarded the Corona Civicata, civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors. It was not granted lightly. To earn it, a soldier had to save the life of a fellow Roman while risking his own. Caesar, barely 20 years old, had already proven that he possessed not only courage, but the ability to inspire those around him. The military was more than just a proving ground for Caesar. It was a school of leadership. He observed how soldiers responded to charisma and confidence. He studied how discipline, when balanced with rewards, created unbreakable loyalty. These lessons would remain with him for the rest of his life. Unlike many aristocrats who treated soldiers as expendable, Caesar saw them as men who would follow him into the impossible if they believed he valued them. But fate had other lessons in store. While traveling through the Aegean Sea, Caesar's ship was attacked by pirates. The Mediterranean was rife with them bands of ruthless men who kidnapped travelers for ransom. Caesar, wealthy in name if not in coin, was seized and held captive. His captors demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, a hefty sum. Caesar, with a boldness that bordered on arrogance, laughed in their faces. "You do not know who you have taken," he told them. "Ask for 50. The pirates, amused by his confidence, agreed. While his companions went to gather the ransom, Caesar remained among the bandits. But he did not behave like a prisoner. He recited poetry to them, joined their games, even mocked their manners. At times he would threaten them, half in jest, half in earnest. "When I am free, I will return, and I will crucify every one of you." The pirates, charmed by his audacity, laughed it off. Yet Caesar was not joking. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he immediately gathered a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, and captured them. True to his word, he had them crucified. But in an act that revealed both cruelty and compassion, he ordered their throats slit before the execution, granting them a quick death. It was a chilling episode, one that revealed the duality of Caesar's character. Charm and charisma on one hand, cold ruthlessness on the other. He could befriend, but he could also destroy. Following these adventures, Caesar traveled to Rhodes to study rhetoric under Apollonius Molon, one of the greatest teachers of oratory in the ancient world. Rome was a city where speeches could topple governments, where words were weapons as sharp as swords. Caesar, determined to master this art, threw himself into study. He learned to control his voice, to use rhythm and emotion, to persuade not just with logic but with passion. His style would later set him apart in the Forum. While many Roman orators droned with pompous authority, Caesar spoke with clarity and energy, winning the hearts of the common people. These years, abroad, soldier, captive, student, were the crucible in which Caesar's identity was forged. He was no longer the boy who had fled Sulla's assassins. He had become a man who understood both the brutality of power and the elegance of persuasion. He had learned that leadership required more than heritage. It required action, courage, and an ability to bend fate to one's will. When he finally returned to Rome, he carried not riches, but something far more valuable: a growing reputation. People whispered of the young noble who had defied pirates, who spoke with the fire of a statesman, who carried himself with the confidence of a general. Caesar was building not just a career, but a legend, and the Republic, unknowingly, was preparing for a man who would one day reshape it entirely. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after his years abroad, he was no longer the untested youth who had once fled from Sulla's assassins. He had been a soldier, a survivor of piracy, and a student of rhetoric. But in Rome, reputation was not enough. One needed influence, alliances, and the skill to navigate the treacherous waters of politics. Caesar's return marked the beginning of his transformation from a daring adventurer into one of Rome's most ambitious politicians. The courts of Rome were his first stage. Caesar began practicing as an advocate, taking on cases against corrupt provincial governors. These trials were dangerous. Governors were often protected by wealthy aristocratic families and by networks of bribery. But Caesar had two weapons: his sharp rhetoric and his willingness to challenge the powerful. His speeches were fiery, passionate, and theatrical. He spoke not in the slow, pompous style of the Senate, but with clarity and urgency, his words cutting through the noise of the forum. The people loved him. Even those who disagreed with his arguments could not deny the force of his delivery. Caesar was proving himself not just as a soldier, but as a man who could command attention with words, as well as with the sword. This talent for oratory naturally aligned him with the populares, the faction of Roman politics that claimed to represent the common people. The populares sought reforms, land redistribution, debt relief, and limits on the power of the Senate. They stood opposed to the optimates, the conservative aristocrats who guarded their privileges fiercely. Caesar's family background, his marriage alliances, and his natural charisma all pushed him toward the populares. It was a dangerous path. The Senate was dominated by optimates, and aligning with the populares often meant conflict with the most powerful men in Rome. But Caesar was willing to risk it. He understood that popularity among the masses could be a weapon stronger than senatorial approval. His personal life also became entangled with politics. After the death of his first wife, Cornelia, Caesar married Pompey, the granddaughter of Sulla. This union was less about love than strategy, linking him to an aristocratic family and broadening his network of influence. Yet this marriage would not last. Pompey was implicated in the scandal of the Festivala, sacred women-only ceremony that had been infiltrated by a man seeking to seduce her. Whether Pompey was guilty or not, Caesar divorced her, stating famously, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." This phrase would echo through history, revealing Caesar's keen sense of image and reputation. Despite setbacks, his rise through the political ladder continued. He secured the position of Pontifex, a priestly role that carried both religious significance and public visibility. Religion in Rome was inseparable from politics, and this role allowed Caesar to appear before the people regularly, strengthening his popularity. He also became military tribune and later quaestor. Small but important steps that gave him both military and administrative experience. Each office he gained built a foundation for higher ambitions. Caesar was also a master of alliances. He cultivated relationships with powerful men who could support his rise. One of the most important was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus saw potential in Caesar and offered financial backing, helping him pay off debts and fund his political campaigns. This relationship would prove critical in the years ahead. But it was not only money and influence that propelled Caesar forward. It was his ability to win the people. He invested heavily in public games and spectacles, even when it meant plunging himself into debt. Gladiatorial contests, theatre performances, and lavish banquets were all ways to secure the loyalty of the masses. To the Senate, this seemed reckless. Caesar was spending beyond his means. But Caesar understood something deeper. In Rome, popularity was power, and power could always repay debts. By the late 70s BCE, Caesar had carved out a place for himself in the complex machinery of Roman politics. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become, but the outlines of his destiny were visible. He was ambitious, charismatic, and unafraid of confrontation. He had allies among the wealthy, loyalty among the people, and enemies in the Senate. It was clear to those who watched him closely that Caesar was not content to remain a minor player. He sought the highest offices, the greatest command, and a legacy that would outshine all others. In his early speeches and actions, the seeds of empire were already sown. Rome was not yet ready to call him dictator, but Rome was beginning to know his name. The boy who had once been hunted by Sulla had returned to the city that had tried to destroy him. And this time, he would not be driven away. Julius Caesar had entered Roman politics, and Rome would never be the same. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome, his ambition was already burning. But ambition alone was not enough to rise in the Republic. Rome demanded visibility, influence, and proof of skill. For a young aristocrat without immense wealth or a powerful army, the most direct path to recognition was through the courts. The Roman Forum was not just a place of commerce and politics, it was a theatre of words. Advocates, much like modern lawyers, would plead cases before the public, defending clients, prosecuting corrupt officials, and swaying opinion with rhetoric. These trials were not conducted in private chambers, but in open spaces where citizens could gather and listen. For ambitious men, they were a stage on which reputations could be made or destroyed. Caesar entered this world with a fierce determination. He had studied rhetoric in Rhodes under Apollonius Molan, one of the greatest teachers of his age, and he was eager to put his training into practice. Unlike the heavy, ponderous style of older senators, Caesar's oratory was sharp, direct, and emotional. He knew how to engage a crowd, when to raise his voice to command attention, and when to soften his tone to win sympathy. He was theatrical without being excessive, persuasive without being predictable. One of his earliest cases was the prosecution of Dolabella, a former governor accused of corruption. Dolabella had abused his power in the provinces, extorting money and exploiting local populations. For Caesar, the case was more than a trial, it was a declaration of intent. By standing against a corrupt official with aristocratic connections, he was signaling his alignment with the Popterus, the faction that sought to challenge the entrenched power of the Senate. Though Dolabella was ultimately acquitted thanks to bribery and the influence of powerful patrons, Caesar's performance made an impression. The people remembered his fiery words, his boldness, and his refusal to cower before the elite. This pattern repeated itself in case after case. Caesar was not always victorious, but victories mattered less than visibility. Every speech added to his reputation as a defender of justice and a champion of the common man. He cultivated an image of courage, standing up against corruption even when the odds were stacked against him. Too many in the crowd, Caesar was not just another ambitious nobleman. He was someone who might bring change to a republic weighed down by greed and decay. Beyond the courts, Caesar used oratory in other ways. He spoke at funerals, where eloquence could turn a simple remembrance into a political statement. At the funeral of his aunt Julia, who was connected to Gaius Marius, Caesar boldly displayed images of Marius that had been banned by Sulla. The crowd roared with approval. It was a calculated act of defiance, linking himself to the populares while reviving the memory of a leader many still admired. Caesar also mastered the art of public speaking in the Senate, though at this early stage his influence there was limited. Surrounded by older, more experienced senators, he relied on passion and clarity to make his voice heard. While others spoke in dense, legalistic language, Caesar spoke to be understood. He had the rare gift of making complex issues accessible to ordinary citizens. Oratory was more than a tool, it was Caesar's weapon. He understood that Rome was as much about perception as reality. A well-delivered speech could win allies, stir crowds, and intimidate opponents. Even when he lost cases, he often gained something more valuable: visibility and support among the people. But Caesar's rise as an orator was not without cost. His confrontations with powerful men made him enemies in the Senate. The Optimates, already wary of his family connections and his populist leanings, began to see him as a dangerous agitator. Yet this was exactly the kind of attention Caesar sought. To him, controversy was not a liability, was fuel. Every attack from the Optimates only reinforced his image as a man of the people standing against the aristocratic elite. By the end of this phase of his career, Caesar had established himself as one of Rome's most compelling voices. He was not yet the military titan he would become, nor the dictator who would reshape the republic, but his words were laying the foundation. He was learning that persuasion, performance, and perception could open doors as effectively as swords. For Caesar, the Forum had become a battlefield, and oratory his weapon of choice. And though his victories were measured not in conquests but in cheers and whispers, he was winning the war for Rome's attention. In Rome, politics was war by other means. Armies and swords could conquer provinces, but in the Forum, the true weapons were alliances, rhetoric, and the ability to command public opinion. For Julius Caesar, aligning himself with the popularist, the political faction that claimed to represent the voice of the people, was both a natural step and a dangerous gamble. The populares stood in contrast to the Optimates, the conservative aristocrats who dominated the Senate. The Optimates defended the privileges of the wealthy elite, resisted reforms, and guarded the traditions of the Republic. The populares, on the other hand, championed land redistribution, debt relief, and policies aimed at easing the burdens of the common citizens. In reality, both factions were driven by ambition as much as ideology. But to the people of Rome, the populares represented hope for a fairer republic. Caesar had every reason to choose this path. His aunt Julia had been the wife of Gaius Marius, the great general and populist leader who had clashed with Sulla, the champion of the By invoking Marius's memory, Caesar could position himself as the natural heir to the populist tradition. At Julia's funeral, he made a bold move. He displayed images of Marius that had been banned by Sulla's regime. The crowd erupted in applause. It was an unmistakable declaration Caesar was a populist, unafraid to challenge the memory of Rome's conservative dictatorship, but aligning with the populares was more than symbolism. Caesar actively courted the urban poor and the plebeian assemblies. He sponsored lavish public games, festivals, and gladiatorial contests, often going into debt to fund them. To his critics, this was reckless extravagance. To Caesar, it was an investment. Every spectacle brought him visibility and loyalty. Crowds cheered his name, and in Rome, the cheers of the people were currency more valuable than gold. He also worked to build ties with powerful populares leaders. He forged connections with men like Crassus, who, though not strictly a populist, was willing to support Caesar financially because he saw in him a rising star. Crassus's fortune, the largest in Rome, allowed Caesar to cover his massive debts. In return, Caesar offered political loyalty and influence among the people. It was a partnership of convenience, but one that would prove vital to his rise. Caesar's populist stance also shaped his speeches in the Senate and the courts. He denounced the corruption of governors, called for justice for Rome's allies, and demanded relief for citizens crushed by debt. Though the Senate resisted, Caesar's fiery words resonated with the assemblies. He became known not only as an orator but as a champion of justice, at least, as Rome understood it. The Optimates, however, began to take notice. To them, Caesar was more than just another ambitious young man. He was dangerous. He threatened the balance of power by stirring up the people against the Senate. His willingness to spend lavishly and his connections to Crassus made him all the more concerning. They tried to curb his influence, but each attack only increased his popularity among the masses. Caesar had mastered a crucial skill, turning opposition into fuel for his own reputation. Marriage also played a role in his populist image. After divorcing Pompey, Caesar did not rush into another alliance with the conservative elite. Instead, he used his family ties and friendships to strengthen his bond with the populares. These personal relationships, combined with his political maneuvers, created a network of support that would carry him through the treacherous years ahead. By the late 70s and early 60s BCE, Caesar's alignment with the populares was unmistakable. He had staked his future on the belief that Rome's discontented masses could elevate him beyond the reach of the Senate's opposition. He gambled on debt, spectacle, and daring rhetoric. To many observers, it looked like recklessness. To Caesar, it was strategy. He was building a base of support, not in marble halls, but in the hearts of the Roman people. And yet, Caesar was no mere demagogue. He was calculating. He knew that popularity alone could not secure real power. To rule Rome, he would need both the love of the people and the cooperation of powerful allies. The Optimates would never willingly grant him authority. But if he could unite the populares and secure the backing of wealthy patrons like Crassus and, perhaps, the military support of generals like Pompey, then he could rise to heights that no one had imagined. This delicate balance of populist appeal and elite support was the key to Caesar's early career. It was not simply ideology, it was survival. In Rome, a man without allies was doomed. Caesar was building a coalition, piece by piece, that would soon transform Roman politics. The young advocate, who had once fought corruption in the court, was now becoming something greater. A politician with the loyalty of the people, the support of powerful patrons, and a vision of a Rome reshaped by his hand. The Republic had underestimated him, but soon it would be impossible to ignore him. In the Republic of Rome, power was not seized overnight. It was climbed step by step through the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices that defined the political career of every ambitious Roman. For Julius Caesar, each rung was more than a title, it was a test, an opportunity to prove himself to the people, and a platform to prepare for greater ambitions. Caesar's first significant office was that of military tribune, a modest position but one that offered valuable experience. As a tribune, he was responsible for assisting commanders, maintaining discipline, and ensuring the welfare of soldiers. Though not a high-ranking post, it gave him insight into the lives of Rome's legions. Unlike many aristocrats who treated soldiers as expendable tools, Caesar made an effort to understand them, to speak with them, and to win their loyalty. This early exposure would later shape his unique bond with his armies. From there, he pursued the office of quaestor, a financial administrator responsible for managing public funds and assisting provincial governors. Caesar served as quaestor in Hispania Ulteria, one of Rome's distant provinces. It was in Spain that he encountered, perhaps for the first time, the dream of empire. According to legend, while visiting a statue of Alexander the Great, Caesar wept. He was in his early 30s, and he realized that at the same age, Alexander had conquered much of the known world. Caesar, by comparison, had achieved little. The moment burned into him a sense of urgency. He was destined for more than provincial administration. He wanted glory, conquest, and immortality. When his quaestorship ended, Caesar returned to Rome, his ambition sharper than ever. He sought election as aedile, a role responsible for public buildings, festivals, and games. The office was notoriously expensive, as citizens expected lavish spectacles. Caesar, already deep in debt, plunged further into financial ruin to give the people the entertainment they craved. Gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, public feasts, he spared no expense. Critics mocked his extravagance, but the crowds adored him. Rome's streets echoed with his name, and though creditors whispered of bankruptcy, Caesar understood the investment he was making. In the Republic, popularity was the most valuable currency. It was during his time as aedile that Caesar made one of his boldest political moves. He restored and displayed images of Gaius Marius, his uncle by marriage, whose memory had been suppressed by Sulla. By honoring Marius, Caesar openly aligned himself with the populares and reminded Rome of a man who had once challenged the aristocracy. The display electrified the people and enraged the Senate. To the optimates, Caesar was resurrecting old ghosts and stirring dangerous passions. To the masses, he was a hero unafraid to defy tradition. His growing popularity soon carried him to the office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. This position was not merely religious, it was deeply political. As the head of Rome's state religion, the Pontifex Maximus held immense influence over public rituals, festivals, and sacred law. Caesar campaigned aggressively for the office, again borrowing heavily to fund bribes and secure votes. His victory shocked the Senate. At an age when most men could only dream of such power, Caesar had seized one of the most prestigious positions in Rome. The role allowed him to maintain constant visibility in public life. His presence was felt in ceremonies, in religious debates, and in the daily rhythm of Roman society. Religion and politics were inseparable in Rome, and Caesar used his new platform to strengthen his image as a man favored by the gods. Despite his success, Caesar's financial troubles loomed. His debts had grown so enormous that creditors harassed him constantly. Yet here again, his alliance with Marcus Licinius Crassus proved decisive. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, paid off much of Caesar's debt, ensuring his political survival. It was not charity. Crassus expected loyalty and influence in return. For Caesar, the support of Crassus was both a lifeline and a stepping stone toward greater power. By the end of this period, Caesar had climbed rapidly through the ranks. From military tribune to quaestor, from aedile to Pontifex Maximus, he had positioned himself as one of the most visible and popular figures in Rome. He was adored by the people, supported by wealthy patrons, and despised by many senators. In a republic defined by rivalry and ambition, Caesar had made himself impossible to ignore. The road to power was long, and the stakes grew higher with each step. But Caesar had learned the essential truth of Roman politics. Wealth could be borrowed, enemies could be outmaneuvered, and reputation could be built on spectacle. The only thing that mattered was momentum, and Caesar's momentum was unstoppable. As he set his sights on the next offices of the Republic, it was clear that Julius Caesar was no longer simply an ambitious nobleman. He was becoming a force of destiny, a man whose rise could not be contained by tradition or opposition. The Republic had nurtured him, but soon it would struggle to contain him. By the early 60s BCE, Julius Caesar had risen rapidly through the political ladder. He had dazzled the Roman people with lavish games as aedile, shocked the Senate by winning the office of Pontifex Maximus, and built a reputation as one of the Republic's most dynamic figures. Yet, despite his growing popularity, Caesar was still vulnerable. His debts weighed heavily on him, his enemies in the Senate worked constantly to block his ambitions, and he lacked the military glory that gave Rome's greatest men their authority. To secure his future, Caesar needed powerful allies. Rome, at this time, was dominated by two towering figures: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known simply as Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. The two men could not have been more different, nor more bitterly opposed. Pompey was a celebrated general, a man who had defeated pirates, conquered vast territories in the east, and returned to Rome as a hero. Crassus, by contrast, was a financier, an opportunist, infamous for his greed but admired for his cunning. He had crushed the Spartacus slave revolt, though with far less glory than Pompey, who claimed much of the credit. Their rivalry was personal and bitter, and it divided the Republic. Caesar saw opportunity in their enmity. He understood that alone, Pompey and Crassus were powerful but limited. Together, they could dominate Rome. But, because of their hatred for one another, such a union seemed impossible. Caesar's genius lay in persuading them that cooperation was in their interest, that he was the man who could bind them together. The circumstances were ripe. Pompey, despite his military triumphs, faced frustration in the Senate. He wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements, but the Optimates resisted him at every turn. Crassus, for his part, sought financial concessions for the tax collectors who supported him, but he too met stiff opposition. Both men were isolated, powerful, yet constrained by a Senate unwilling to yield. Caesar positioned himself as the solution. He approached each man separately, appealing to their ambitions and frustrations. To Pompey, he promised political support and the chance to secure land for his veterans. To Crassus, he offered the influence needed to win financial relief for his allies. Caesar's pitch was simple. United, they could overcome the Senate's resistance and achieve their goals. Divided, they would continue to be blocked. The result was an informal alliance that later historians would call the First Triumvirate. It was not an official office, nor a legal institution, but rather a pact among three men who agreed to set aside rivalry for mutual gain. Caesar brought charisma and the support of the people. Pompey contributed military prestige and veterans loyal to him, and Crassus provided immense wealth. Together, they formed a triangle of power that overshadowed the Senate itself. The pact was sealed not only with promises, but with marriage. Caesar offered his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey, a gesture that created a bond between the two men that was more than political. Julia and Pompey, by all accounts, shared genuine affection, and their union strengthened the alliance in ways few could have anticipated. With Crassus bound by mutual interest, The three men now controlled enough influence to bend the Republic to their will. When news of the alliance spread, the Senate was shaken. The Optimates, who had long relied on division among Rome's great men, suddenly faced a united front. Their ability to resist was crumbling. The triumvirate was not just a political agreement, it was a revolution in Roman power dynamics. For the first time, three individuals, rather than the Senate as a collective body, held the keys to Rome's future. Caesar, the architect of this union, had achieved what seemed impossible. He had bridged the gap between two bitter rivals and created a coalition strong enough to dominate Rome. For him, the triumvirate was not merely an alliance of convenience, it was the foundation of his rise to ultimate power. Yet alliances built on ambition are fragile. Even as the triumvirate began its work, cracks were already visible. Pompey's pride, Crassus's jealousy, and Caesar's boundless ambition would all test the durability of their pact. For now, however, the Republic trembled before their combined strength. The stage was set for the next great step in Caesar's career. The consulship, the highest elected office in Rome, where he would prove that the triumvirate was not just a theory but a force capable of reshaping the Republic itself. The first triumvirate was never written into law, never proclaimed as an official body of Rome. It existed in whispers, handshakes, and unspoken agreements. To the public, it appeared as though the Republic continued as usual, with elections, debates, and votes. But in reality, three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, were pulling the strings. Holding such a pact together required constant negotiation. Each member of the triumvirate carried his own ambitions, and none of them were known for humility. Caesar sought political dominance and military command. Pompey craved recognition and legitimacy for his eastern conquests, as well as land for his veterans. Crassus hungered for financial concessions and an opportunity to prove himself as more than a banker. Their interests overlapped enough to cooperate, but beneath the surface, jealousy and mistrust simmered. Caesar proved to be the crucial mediator. His charisma allowed him to soothe tensions and remind his partners of what they stood to gain. He understood that the alliance could collapse if Pompey and Crassus turned against each other once more. By presenting himself as the bridge between them, Caesar made himself indispensable. This was his true genius, not merely in commanding armies, but in commanding egos. The alliance soon delivered results. Pompey received approval for land distribution to his veterans, securing their loyalty and quieting potential unrest. His eastern settlements were recognized, granting legitimacy to his achievements abroad. Crassus, in turn, achieved financial relief for the tax collectors who backed him, reinforcing his network of supporters. Caesar himself was rewarded with the office he coveted most, the consulship of 59 BCE, one of the two highest elected positions in Rome. The Senate watched in alarm. They had underestimated Caesar, dismissing him as a popular agitator, a man of debts and theatrics. Now he was consul, wielding authority equal to any in the Republic, and backed by the combined strength of Rome's richest man and Rome's greatest general. Opposition hardened, but resistance seemed futile. The Optimates could not block Caesar without risking open conflict, and so they begrudgingly endured the new balance of power. But the alliance was never free of friction. Pompey and Crassus remained wary of one another. Pompey resented Crassus's wealth and influence, seeing him as a parasite feeding on Rome's treasury. Crassus despised Pompey's military glory. Convinced that his own role in suppressing Spartacus had been overshadowed by Pompey's opportunism, Caesar's task was to keep both men focused on shared goals. But the rivalry could never be erased, it could only be managed. Caesar also understood that alliances alone could not sustain him. He needed to build his own foundation of power. While consul, he pushed through land reforms, secured laws that benefited his allies, and used every tool of his office to expand his influence. He also deepened his bond with Pompey through the marriage of his daughter Julia, strengthening the personal connection that tied them together. For the moment, this union helped keep Pompey loyal to the triumvirate. Yet the alliance was fragile. A temporary truce among ambitious men, each of the three envisioned himself as the dominant figure of Rome's future. Each used the triumvirate as a stepping stone rather than an end in itself. Caesar, perhaps more than the others, understood this truth. He knew that the pact would not last forever. But for now, it gave him what he needed: legitimacy, power, and the chance to secure a military command that would launch him into history. The Senate, though weakened, did not surrender without protest. Many senators denounced Caesar's tactics, calling his consulship lawless and corrupt. But Caesar, backed by Pompey and Crassus, brushed aside their objections. When words failed, he used spectacle, force, or outright intimidation to achieve his goals. He was learning that the Republic's traditions were fragile, and that boldness often triumphed over caution. In balancing the ambitions of his partners, Caesar revealed his political mastery. He was not yet the conqueror of Gaul, nor the dictator of Rome, but already he was shaping the Republic to his advantage. The first triumvirate was a coalition of giants, but it was Caesar who held the reins. Still, all three men sensed the instability of their arrangement. It was a pact born of necessity, not trust. The more they gained, the more their ambitions grew, and the harder it became to keep the alliance intact. For now, though, the triumvirate stood firm, and with Caesar as consul, it was ready to reshape Rome. The next step would test both the alliance and Caesar himself. With his year as consul nearing its end, he needed more than political office. He needed a stage grand enough to prove his greatness. That stage would be the vast untamed lands of Gaul. In the year 59 BCE, Julius Caesar reached the highest elected office of the Roman Republic. The consulship, 2 consuls were elected annually, meant to balance each other's power, and together they served as the chief magistrates of Rome. For Caesar, this was the culmination of years of maneuvering, but also the beginning of something far greater. His consulship would mark the moment when he broke free from being merely popular and became truly unstoppable. Caesar was not alone in this office. His colleague, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, was a staunch supporter of the Optimates, the conservative faction of the Senate. The Senate hoped Bibulus would serve as a counterweight to Caesar, restraining him and ensuring that the consulship did not become a populist spectacle. But the Senate had gravely miscalculated. Caesar was not interested in compromise. He was determined to use his consulship to fulfill the promises he had made to his allies in the first triumvirate. From the very beginning, Caesar pushed forward an ambitious legislative agenda. One of his first and most important proposals was a land reform bill that would distribute land to Pompey's veterans and to Rome's poor citizens. Land reform had long been a contentious issue in Roman politics, resisted fiercely by the Senate, which feared the empowerment of the lower classes. But Caesar pressed on, knowing that Pompey's support and the loyalty of thousands of soldiers depended on it. Bibulus, acting on behalf of the Senate, tried to block the law at every turn. He declared omens unfavorable, claimed religious grounds to delay votes, and attempted to stall Caesar's momentum. But Caesar was relentless. When Bibulus attempted to physically prevent a vote by appearing in the forum with his Caesar's supporters, many of them veterans and ordinary citizens, drove him out with insults, even pelting him with filth. Humiliated and powerless, Bibulus withdrew from public life, retreating to his home and issuing proclamations from there. Rome's citizens mocked him, saying that the year 59 BCE was not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. With Bibulus effectively sidelined, Caesar governed alone. His land reform bill passed, fulfilling his promise to Pompey and further cementing his popularity among the people. He also ensured that Crassus received the financial concessions he desired, winning him relief for the tax collectors. Every step of his consulship demonstrated the strength of the triumvirate. Each man had gotten what he wanted, and Caesar had proven himself the indispensable engine of their success. But Caesar's consulship was not only about rewarding allies, it was about securing his own future. He knew that once his year as consul ended, he could be prosecuted for the many laws he had forced through against the Senate's will. To protect himself, he needed a new source of power, one that would make him untouchable. That power came in the form of a provincial command. At the end of his consulship, Caesar arranged to be granted proconsular authority over Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and Illyricum, on the Adriatic coast. With the later addition of Transalpine Gaul, southern France, the assignment, which was supposed to last for several years, gave him not only military command but also immunity from prosecution. More importantly, it gave him an army and, with it, the opportunity for conquest, glory, and wealth. The Senate was alarmed. They had expected Caesar's consulship to be turbulent, but they had not foreseen how completely he would outmaneuver them. In 1 year, he had satisfied Pompey, secured Crassus's loyalty, won the love of the people, and positioned himself for a grand military adventure. Rome had seen ambitious consuls before, but none who left office with so much momentum. As 59 BCE came to a close, Caesar had achieved everything he needed. The alliance with Pompey was strengthened by the marriage to his daughter Julia. Crassus's support was secure, thanks to financial concessions and political favors. The people adored him for his land reforms and spectacles. And most importantly, he now held a command that promised not just survival, but greatness. Behind him lay the Republic, strained by conflict but still intact. Ahead of him lay Gaul, a vast land filled with tribes that Rome had not yet subdued. It was there that Caesar would transform himself from a clever politician into a legendary general. The consulship of 59 BCE had secured his foundation. What followed would shake Rome and the world to its core. For Caesar, politics had always been about more than office or prestige. It was about power, survival, and destiny. In his year as consul, he had proven that boldness could shatter tradition, that alliances could overcome rivals, and that Rome itself could be bent to the will of one man. The Senate had tried to tame him with Bibulus, but instead they had unleashed a force they could no longer control. The Republic had not yet fallen, but the cracks were spreading. And as Caesar marched toward his new command in Gaul, the world was about to meet not just a politician, but a conqueror. When Julius Caesar left Rome in 58 BCE to assume his new command in Gaul, he stepped onto a stage far greater than any political office could provide. For centuries, the lands beyond the Alps had been a source of fear and fascination for Rome. The memory of the Gallic invasion 3 centuries earlier, when barbarian tribes had sacked the city itself, still haunted the Roman imagination. Gaul represented both danger and opportunity. Danger in its fierce, independent tribes, an opportunity in the wealth, land, and glory that conquest could bring. Caesar's appointment gave him command over Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Illyricum on the Adriatic, and later Transalpine Gaul, southern France. But beyond these provinces lay the unconquered lands of the Gallic tribes. vast territories divided among dozens of independent peoples. Unlike Rome, Gaul was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of clans and confederations, constantly feuding with one another. This disunity would become Caesar's greatest advantage. The Gauls were fierce warriors, known for their courage, their wild charges into battle, and their loyalty to their chieftains. They painted their bodies, fought with longswords, and prized personal bravery above all else. But they lacked the discipline and organization of Rome's legions. Caesar, with his professional soldiers, strict training, and mastery of logistics, understood that Rome's order could triumph over Gallic chaos. The spark for Caesar's campaigns came quickly. The Helvetii, a large Gallic tribe from modern-day Switzerland, decided to migrate westward in search of new lands. Their movement threatened both Roman allies in the region and the balance of power in Gaul. Caesar seized the opportunity. Presenting himself as the protector of Rome's friends, he marched his legions to intercept the Helvetii. The campaign against the Helvetii would be Caesar's first great test. The tribe numbered in the tens of thousands, including warriors, women, and children. Their migration was less an invasion than a mass exodus, but Caesar framed it as a threat to Rome's security. By confronting them, he justified his presence in Gaul and demonstrated his readiness to act decisively. At the Battle of Bebract, Caesar's legions clashed with the Helvetii in a brutal fight. The Roman discipline held firm against the Gallic fury. Legionaries fought in tight formation, shields interlocked, advancing steadily against the chaotic charges of their enemies. After hours of fierce combat, the Helvetii were defeated. Caesar pursued them relentlessly, forcing their surrender and sending them back to their homeland. This victory was more than a military triumph, it was a political statement. Caesar had proven to Rome, to the Gauls, and to his own soldiers that he was a commander of rare skill. His dispatches to the Senate, later compiled into the Commentario de Bello Gallico, framed the victory as a defense of Roman allies, painting him as both protector and conqueror. But Caesar's ambitions did not stop with the Helvetii. Almost immediately, another opportunity arose. The Germanic king Ariovistus had crossed the Rhine with his warriors, threatening the balance of power in Gaul. Many Gallic tribes appealed to Caesar for help, and he seized the chance to expand his influence further. The confrontation with Ariovistus was dangerous. The Germans were formidable, larger in number than the Helvetii, and Caesar's own soldiers were gripped by fear. Yet Caesar displayed his hallmark leadership. He addressed his troops directly, reminding them of their discipline, their past victories, and their duty to Rome. His confidence reignited their courage. The battle against Ariovistus was fierce but decisive. Roman tactics, discipline, and Caesar's ability to maneuver his legions carried the day. Ariovistus fled across the Rhine, and the German threat was pushed back for now. In just a single year, Caesar had transformed his command from a provincial post into the foundation of a grand conquest. He had defeated two major threats, secured his reputation as a general, and positioned himself as the master of Gaul. For Rome, these victories were cause for celebration. The Senate, even those who despised him, could not deny the scale of his success. For Caesar himself, they were only the beginning. He knew that each battle fought in Gaul was also a battle for his future in Rome. The more he conquered, the more wealth, soldiers, and prestige he gained. The conquest of Gaul had begun, and with it, the rise of Julius Caesar as a military legend. The tribes of Gaul had underestimated the determination of Rome's new commander. Soon, they would realize that Caesar was not merely defending Rome's allies, he was reshaping the destiny of their entire world. The defeat of the Helvetii and the Germans under Ariovistus established Julius Caesar as a force to be reckoned with in Gaul. Yet those early victories were merely the prelude to a far more ambitious project: the systematic conquest of an entire region stretching from the Alps to the Atlantic, from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. For Caesar, Gaul was not simply a battlefield, it was a stage upon which he would build his legend. What made Caesar truly dangerous to his enemies was not just his courage in battle, but his genius for strategy and logistics. He understood that armies did not march on bravery alone, they marched on supply. Roads were built, rivers bridged, and camps fortified with astonishing speed. His engineers could construct siege works in days that others might take months to complete. These feats of organization gave the legions an edge over Gallic tribes, who relied on quick raids and spontaneous charges, but lacked the infrastructure to sustain prolonged campaigns. Caesar's use of speed and surprise became his hallmark. He often marched his legions faster than anyone thought possible, appearing in places where enemies believed him still days away. By catching tribes off guard, he could scatter them before they had time to assemble. This relentless pace wore down his opponents and reminded them that resistance was futile. But Caesar's brilliance was paired with ruthless brutality. When tribes resisted Rome, he punished them with devastating severity. Towns were burned, fields destroyed, and captives sold into slavery by the thousands. These harsh measures were not acts of random cruelty, they were deliberate demonstrations meant to terrify others into submission. For every Gallic leader who considered rebellion, the memory of Caesar's wrath loomed large. One striking example was the destruction of the Veneti, a seafaring people of northwestern Gaul. When they captured Roman envoys and resisted submission, Caesar responded with unrelenting force. He ordered the construction of a fleet, adapting Roman tactics to fight at sea. At the Battle of Morbihan Gulf, his navy trapped the Veneti ships, cutting their rigging with hooks and rendering them helpless. The Veneti were annihilated, their leaders executed, and their people sold into slavery. The message was clear. Betrayal of Rome would be met with annihilation. At the same time, Caesar proved equally adept at diplomacy. He did not rely solely on force. He exploited the rivalries among Gallic tribes, forming alliances with some to fight against others. He presented himself as a protector of allies, rewarding those who supported him with privileges and punishing those who defied him. This divide-and-conquer approach allowed him to expand Roman influence without fighting every tribe at once. Many chiefs preferred to side with Caesar rather than risk destruction. The dual nature of his approach, merciless in punishment, generous in reward, earned him both fear and loyalty. Some Gauls saw him as a liberator from rival tribes, while others cursed him as a destroyer. Either way, all recognized that resistance carried enormous risk. Caesar also mastered the art of propaganda. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written as reports to the Senate, portrayed his campaigns as defensive rather than aggressive. He claimed to act always in Rome's interest, protecting allies and ensuring security. In reality, his campaigns were a relentless expansion of Roman power. But in Rome, where citizens hungered for victories and glory, his dispatches were read with admiration. Caesar was not only winning battles, he was winning hearts and minds in the capital. The spoils of war further strengthened his position. Vast wealth flowed from Gaul into Caesar's coffers, allowing him to pay his debts and enrich his soldiers. Gold, slaves, and resources poured into Rome, making Caesar's successes impossible to ignore. His legions, rewarded with loot and bound by loyalty to their commander, became a formidable instrument of power. loyal not to the Senate, but to Caesar himself. This combination of speed, discipline, brutality, diplomacy, and propaganda created a machine of conquest, unlike anything the Gauls had faced. Over the next several years, tribe after tribe fell before Rome's legions. Resistance was crushed, alliances forged, and Roman dominance extended deeper into Gaul. Yet, with every victory, Caesar's shadow over Rome grew longer. Senators who had once dismissed him as a reckless populist now saw in him the makings of a rival to the Republic itself. But in Gaul, those concerns mattered little. Caesar was building an empire of his own, one battle at a time, and his soldiers followed him with a devotion that bordered on worship. The conquest of Gaul was not just a military campaign, it was a transformation. Caesar was no longer simply a politician with debts and charm. He was becoming Rome's greatest general, a man whose name carried both awe and dread. For the Gauls, the storm had only begun. For Caesar, the horizon held promises of eternal glory. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul was not achieved by strategy and brutality alone. Behind every victory stood the Roman legionary, the disciplined soldier who marched, fought, and bled across the rugged landscapes of Europe. What set Caesar apart from other commanders was not only his genius in battle, but the extraordinary devotion of his troops. His legions did not merely obey him, they adored him. This bond between general and soldier became one of the cornerstones of his power. Unlike many aristocrats who commanded from a distance, Caesar shared in the hardships of his men. He marched alongside them, endured the same weather, ate the same rations, and often slept on the ground as they did. He was present not as a distant noble, but as a fellow soldier. The legionaries saw this, and it bred respect. When they waded through icy rivers or hacked roads through dense forests, they knew their commander endured it too. In an army where morale was everything, this solidarity made Caesar beloved. Caesar also knew the value of communication. He spoke directly to his men, addressing them not with aloof commands, but with speeches designed to inspire courage and pride. Before major battles, he gathered his troops and reminded them of their victories, their discipline, and the rewards awaiting them. He praised their bravery, and when necessary, he scolded their doubts. His words carried weight because they came from a man who had proven his own courage time and again. Reward was another cornerstone of loyalty. Caesar ensured that his soldiers were well compensated. Booty from conquered tribes was distributed fairly, and promises of land and wealth kept the men fighting with zeal. He understood that loyalty could be bought, but it had to be maintained with consistency and fairness. Soldiers who felt cheated would turn resentful, but Caesar rarely allowed dissatisfaction to fester. His legions knew that victory under Caesar meant both honor and tangible reward, but loyalty was not forged through generosity alone. Caesar demanded discipline, and he enforced it ruthlessly. Cowardice and desertion were punished severely. At times, entire units faced decimation, a brutal practice where 1 in 10 soldiers was executed by their comrades as punishment for failure. Yet these moments, harsh as they were, reinforced the idea that discipline was sacred. The soldiers accepted it because Caesar balanced severity with care. He was harsh when he had to be, but never petty or arbitrary. Stories of his personal bravery further deepened their devotion. In one battle against the Nervi, Caesar himself seized a shield, rushed to the front lines, and rallied his men when the legions were wavering. His presence in the thick of combat electrified the soldiers, turning near defeat into victory. To fight under a general who would risk his life alongside them was a source of pride and inspiration. Caesar also created a sense of personal connection. He remembered names, recognized acts of bravery, and rewarded valor with public praise. In an army of thousands, a word of acknowledgement from Caesar could make a soldier feel immortal. This attention to detail bound the men to him as individuals, not just as faceless units. Over time, the loyalty of Caesar's legions transformed into something deeper. Devotion to Caesar himself, not Rome. His men called him Imperator with reverence, following him not because the Senate commanded it, but because Caesar had earned it. They believed in his destiny, and they tied their own fortunes to his. This loyalty was tested many times in Gaul. Battles were brutal, campaigns exhausting, winters unforgiving. Yet time and again, the soldiers endured because they trusted Caesar. They believed he would lead them to victory, that their sacrifices would not be wasted. Even when vastly outnumbered, they marched with confidence, knowing their general would find a way. The bond between Caesar and his men would have consequences far beyond Gaul. When the time came to challenge the Senate and march on Rome, it was this loyalty that made the impossible possible. No bribe, no decree, no Senate command could sever the tie between Caesar and his legions. They had fought and bled together across Gaul, and they would follow him anywhere. By the late 50s BCE, Caesar was no longer just a Roman politician or even a successful general. He was a leader with an army whose devotion made him one of the most dangerous men in the Republic. The conquest of Gaul had given him more than land and wealth. It had given him soldiers who would die for him, and with them, the power to reshape Rome itself. The Senate could pretend to control him, but in truth, Caesar commanded something greater than political office, the hearts of his men, and that loyalty, forged in mud, blood, and iron, would soon shake the Republic to its foundations. Julius Caesar's rise was not built on brute force alone. Many men in Rome had wealth, armies, or powerful friends, yet few rose to the heights Caesar achieved. What set him apart was a rare gift of charisma. Caesar possessed the ability to persuade, to inspire, and to draw people to him in ways that transcended politics and war. His words could ignite crowds, his presence could disarm enemies, and his personal charm could win over even those sworn to oppose him. From his earliest days as an advocate in the courts, Caesar demonstrated his mastery of persuasion. He spoke with clarity and passion, weaving logic with emotion. Unlike the stiff, formal oratory of many senators, Caesar's speeches resonated with the common citizen. He avoided jargon, choosing instead vivid language that painted pictures in the minds of listeners. He could be sharp and fiery when attacking corruption, or gentle and consoling when appealing for mercy. This flexibility gave him a versatility few could match. But Caesar's charisma went beyond words. He had a commanding presence, tall, graceful, and confident. Contemporary sources described his sharp eyes and refined manners. Even in the chaos of battle or the tension of the Senate, he exuded calm authority. People felt drawn to him, sensing both his ambition and his assurance. In a republic filled with arrogance and bluster, Caesar's charm stood out as genuine, or at least skillfully performed. One of Caesar's greatest tools of persuasion was his ability to make people feel seen. Whether addressing thousands of soldiers or speaking to a single senator, he gave the impression that he was speaking directly to them. He remembered names, acknowledged small favors, and praised even minor acts of loyalty. This personal touch created bonds that lasted, turning acquaintances into allies and soldiers into loyal followers. His charisma also extended to his enemies. Caesar had a remarkable capacity to win over those who once opposed him. Many men who began as rivals ended as allies, persuaded by his generosity, his forgiveness, or his sheer force of personality. For example, after defeating tribes in Gaul, Caesar often spared their leaders and incorporated them into Rome's system, turning former foes into loyal subjects. This practice was not simply mercy, it was strategic persuasion, transforming hostility into support. Caesar's persuasive power was perhaps most visible in his relationship with the Roman people. He knew how to stage spectacles that captured the public imagination. Gladiatorial games, public feasts, and triumphal parades all became tools of influence. Yet Caesar himself was always at the center, the figure who embodied Rome's greatness. He cultivated an image not just of a leader, but of a man chosen by fate to bring glory to the Republic. In politics, this charisma was invaluable. When he stood for election, his ability to connect with ordinary citizens gave him a decisive edge. His debts, which would have destroyed lesser men, were overlooked because the people believed in him. Creditors might grumble, but crowds cheered his name, and in Rome, popularity often outweighed financial prudence. Even in private life, Caesar's charm was legendary. His wit, his hospitality, and his romantic affairs all contributed to his reputation as a man who lived fully and passionately. Critics mocked him as vain or indulgent, but admirers saw him as vibrant and human. His famous affair with Cleopatra would later scandalize Rome, but it also reinforced his image as a man of irresistible magnetism. Underlying all of this was Caesar's deep understanding of psychology. He knew that people were motivated not only by reason, but by pride, fear, and hope. He played to these emotions masterfully, whether rallying soldiers before a battle or addressing the Senate after a victory. He understood that loyalty was born not from obligation, but from belligerence. He made people believe in him. Caesar's charisma and gift of persuasion were not mere ornaments to his power. They were the foundation upon which everything else rested. Armies could be bought, laws could be passed, but without persuasion, none of it would endure. Caesar bound people to him with words, gestures, and presence, and in doing so, he created a following that no decree of the Senate could dissolve. It was this charisma, as much as his military genius, that made Caesar unstoppable. Others had commanded armies, but few had commanded hearts. Rome was learning that Caesar's greatest conquest might not be foreign tribes or rival generals, but the very minds of those who lived under the shadow of his ambition. Julius Caesar was a man of paradoxes. He could be merciful to a defeated enemy one day and utterly ruthless the next. He demanded iron discipline from his soldiers, yet he showed them warmth and camaraderie rare among Roman generals. It was this combination, mercy, discipline, and ruthlessness, that defined his leadership. His men feared him, loved him, and followed him with unwavering devotion. His enemies, meanwhile, never knew whether to expect clemency or destruction. Mercy was one of Caesar's most effective political tools. Unlike many Roman commanders, who sought glory through annihilation, Caesar often spared defeated foes. In Gaul, when tribes surrendered, he would frequently pardon their leaders, integrating them into Rome's system rather than exterminating them. He knew that forgiveness could be more powerful than punishment, creating allies from former enemies and ensuring stability in conquered regions. This policy of clemency extended even to his Roman rivals. During the Civil War, years later, Caesar repeatedly spared senators and generals who had fought against him. His enemies called it arrogance, but his supporters praised it as magnanimity. Yet Caesar's mercy was never guaranteed. He wielded it selectively as a weapon of persuasion. Those who submitted early might be pardoned, but those who resisted fiercely faced ruthless retribution. Entire cities could be slaughtered or enslaved. If they defied him too long, the destruction of the Veneti in Gaul where leaders were executed and people sold into slavery, stood as a grim warning to others. Caesar understood fear as well as gratitude. By alternating between mercy and brutality, he kept his enemies off balance. They never knew which fate awaited them, and that uncertainty itself became a form of control. For his soldiers, Caesar's leadership blended harsh discipline with genuine care. Discipline was the backbone of the Roman army, and Caesar enforced it relentlessly. Marches were grueling. Punishments for cowardice severe, a kill. If a unit failed in battle, he did not hesitate to impose the dreaded practice of decimation, where one soldier in 10 was executed by his comrades. Such measures instilled terror and ensured that failure was not an option. But discipline under Caesar was not merely about fear. He also shared in the hardships of his men. He marched alongside them, endured cold winters in the same rough quarters, and ate the same meager rations. When roads needed to be built or fortifications raised, Caesar worked with his soldiers. This balance of strictness and solidarity created a bond unlike any other. His legions respected his authority, but they also loved him as one of their own. Caesar's ruthlessness extended beyond the battlefield. In politics, he showed little hesitation to crush those who opposed him. As consul, he humiliated his colleague Bibulus, effectively sidelining him from office. When the Senate resisted his reforms, he bypassed them with populist assemblies, forcing his laws through regardless of tradition. He did not fear confrontation. He welcomed it. For Caesar, rules were obstacles, not boundaries. His willingness to break them when necessary shocked the Senate but thrilled the people. What made Caesar extraordinary was his ability to decide, often in an instant, whether mercy or ruthlessness would serve him best. He was pragmatic, not sentimental. Mercy was given when it strengthened his position. Cruelty was unleashed when it instilled fear. He understood that leadership was not about consistent ideology, but about calculated choices that advanced his power. This unpredictability made him both admired and feared. To his soldiers, he was a commander who rewarded loyalty and punished weakness. To his enemies, he was a conqueror who might forgive or destroy, depending on what best served his ambition. To the Roman people, he was a leader who seemed both human in his compassion and godlike in his authority. In combining these qualities, Caesar forged a leadership style that was uniquely his own. Others had been merciful, others cruel, others disciplined, but few blended all three with such precision. It gave him flexibility, the ability to adapt to every circumstance, and the aura of a man who was more than mortal. For Caesar, mercy and ruthlessness were not opposites. They were tools, wielded with equal skill. His discipline bound his soldiers, his clemency won allies, and his cruelty silenced resistance. Together, these elements created a power that no Senate decree could restrain, and no rival general could match. It was this mixture that made him not only a conqueror, but a leader whose name would endure for millennia. Julius Caesar was a man who lived in two worlds. In Rome, he was a politician, navigating the labyrinth of Senate debates, alliances, and rivalries. In Gaul, he was a general, commanding legions, conquering tribes, and building an empire. To understand his rise, one must understand how these two identities, politician and general, intertwined and reinforced each other. Caesar was not merely a soldier who stumbled into politics, nor a politician who happened to command an army. He was both, fully and completely, and it was this duality that made him unstoppable. As a politician, Caesar mastered the art of influence. He knew how to charm the masses, sway the assemblies, and manipulate public opinion. His spectacles in Rome, his speeches in the Forum, and his alignment with the populares gave him a foundation of popular support. He played the Senate skillfully, bypassing its resistance when necessary and forging alliances that gave him leverage. His partnership with Pompey and Crassus in the first triumvirate showed his ability to unite powerful men around his vision, even when they despised one another. In politics, Caesar thrived on risk. He borrowed vast sums of money, knowing that his popularity would shield him from ruin. He challenged tradition, confident that his boldness would win where caution failed. As a general, Caesar revealed a different set of talents. He was disciplined, calculating, and ruthless when necessary. He understood logistics, terrain, and timing with a precision that allowed him to outmaneuver enemies larger in number and fiercer in spirit. His campaigns in Gaul demonstrated not only his military genius but his relentless drive. He fought not merely to defend Rome, as his dispatches claimed, but to carve out glory for himself. His soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships, rewarded their loyalty, and led from the front. Unlike many commanders who stayed behind the lines, Caesar was often at the heart of battle, shield in hand, rallying his men. The synergy between politician and general was Caesar's greatest strength. Victories in Gaul translated into triumphs in Rome. Every report he sent back was carefully crafted to portray him as the defender of Rome's allies, the savior of civilization against barbarian chaos. His Commentari de Bello Gallico were not dry records, but masterpieces of propaganda, written in clear Latin that even ordinary citizens could admire. They made him a household name, transforming military campaigns into political capital. At the same time, his political instincts shaped his generalship. He knew that conquest alone was not enough. He needed to present himself as merciful and just, to win over tribes and secure lasting control. He cultivated allies among Gallic leaders, rewarding loyalty with protection, and punishing betrayal with devastating swiftness. These gestures were political acts on the battlefield, reinforcing his image not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler in waiting. Yet this duality also bred tension. In Rome, senators grew increasingly alarmed at his growing power. They saw that his victories in Gaul were not merely strengthening Rome, they were making Caesar too powerful for the Republic to contain. Each conquest gave him wealth, soldiers, and prestige. Each political maneuver tightened his grip on the people. Caesar was becoming less a servant of the state and more a rival to it. For Caesar himself, the line between politician and general blurred. His political ambitions drove his military campaigns, and his military triumphs fueled his political power. He could not separate one from the other. He did not fight in Gaul merely to expand Rome's borders. He fought to expand his own destiny. Nor did he maneuver in politics simply to pass laws. He maneuvered to secure armies, commands, and provinces that would give him the chance to conquer. This combination made him a figure unlike any Rome had seen before. Others had been great generals, Marius, Sulla, and Pompey, but their political skills were limited. Others had been shrewd politicians, but they lacked military glory. Caesar embodied both. He could stand in the forum and win the hearts of the masses, then march into Gaul and win the loyalty of hardened soldiers. He was equally at home in the Senate's marble halls and in the mud of the battlefield. This duality is what terrified the Senate most. A politician could be checked by elections, a general by political oversight, but a man who was both politician and general, adored by the people and backed by an army, was nearly unstoppable. Caesar had become such a man. By the late 50s BCE, Caesar was no longer just a consul who had secured a command. He was a conqueror whose victories reverberated across Rome, and a politician whose influence reached into every corner of the Republic. The Republic's institutions were designed to contain ambition, but Caesar had transcended them. The blend of politician and general had created not just a powerful man, but a phenomenon. Caesar was no longer playing by Rome's rules, he was rewriting them. And soon, the Republic would face the full force of this extraordinary dual identity. By the year 52 BCE, Julius Caesar had spent nearly 7 years in Gaul. Victory after victory had expanded Roman control across vast territories, bringing tribes to heel and flooding Rome with wealth and slaves. Yet conquest breeds resentment. The Gauls, proud and fiercely independent, grew weary of Roman domination. Beneath the surface of Caesar's triumphs, anger simmered, waiting for a leader bold enough to unite the fractured tribes. That leader emerged in the form of Vercingetorix, a young nobleman of the Arverni tribe. His name meant Great King of Warriors, and he lived up to it. Tall, charismatic, and skilled in war. Vercingetorix possessed the rare ability to inspire unity among people who had long been divided. Where others had bowed to Rome, he raised the banner of resistance. His vision was simple yet powerful: to unite the Gallic tribes in a common cause, to drive out the Romans, and to reclaim their freedom. Vercingetorix understood that the Gallic way of war-brave charges, local skirmishes, and disunity could never overcome the disciplined legions of Rome. He needed a new strategy, one that could exploit Rome's weaknesses. He adopted a policy of scorched earth, destroying fields, burning villages, and denying Caesar's armies the supplies they needed to sustain their campaigns. It was a brutal tactic, sacrificing Gallic homes and livelihoods, but it forced Caesar to stretch his lines thin. Scrambling for resources in hostile territory, the revolt spread like wildfire. Tribe after tribe joined Vercingetorix, swelling his forces. For the first time, Caesar faced not a scattered enemy, but a coalition determined to resist him. The balance of power in Gaul was shifting, and for the first time since his arrival, Caesar was on the defensive. Caesar responded with characteristic boldness. He moved swiftly, marching his legions through snow and across rivers to keep his enemies off balance. He could not allow the rebellion to gain momentum. Yet even with his speed, he found himself facing setbacks. At the city of Gergovia, Vercingetorix outmaneuvered him, using the terrain to his advantage. Caesar's assault faltered, and his legions suffered a rare defeat. The loss emboldened the Gauls, convincing many wavering tribes to join the revolt. Vercingetorix capitalized on this momentum. His leadership was magnetic, his confidence unshakable. To his warriors, he was more than a chieftain. He was the embodiment of Gallic pride and freedom. Songs were sung of his courage, and tribes that had once fought bitterly against one another now stood shoulder to shoulder under his command. For a brief moment, the dream of a united Gaul seemed within reach. Caesar, however, was not easily undone. Defeat at Gergovia stung, but it did not break him. He rallied his troops, reminded them of their past victories, and prepared for the decisive confrontation he knew was coming. He recognized that the rebellion could not be suppressed with minor battles or piecemeal skirmishes. The fate of Gaul and, perhaps, of his own career would hinge on a single, massive clash. Both sides understood the stakes. For Vercingetorix, it was a fight for survival, the last hope of casting out the Romans. For Caesar, it was a chance to crush the rebellion once and for all, to secure not only Gaul but his own place in history. The confrontation would come at Alesia, a fortified hilltop stronghold where Vercingetorix and his coalition would make their stand. The coming battle would be one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history, a test of ingenuity, endurance, and sheer willpower. It would decide not only the fate of Gaul, but the future of Julius Caesar. In the autumn of 52 BCE, the struggle between Julius Caesar and the united Gallic tribes reached its climax. Vercingetorix, the charismatic Arvernian chieftain, had withdrawn with his forces to the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a stronghold perched high on a plateau with steep slopes on every side. Behind its walls, he gathered tens of thousands of warriors, determined to resist Caesar's advance. For the Gauls, Alesia was to be the rallying point of their freedom. For Caesar, it was the place where he would either secure eternal glory or see his ambitions collapse. The odds were daunting. Vercingetorix commanded perhaps 80,000 warriors within the walls. With the promise of reinforcements from tribes across Gaul, Caesar had roughly 50,000 legions. To assault the fortress directly would have been suicidal. Instead, Caesar chose a strategy as audacious as it was brilliant. He would starve Alesia into submission. Caesar ordered his engineers to construct an immense ring of fortifications circumvallation, the entire fortress. Towers, ditches, palisades, and traps were built in record time. The fortifications stretched for miles, sealing the defenders inside. But Caesar's genius did not stop there. He anticipated that Gallic reinforcements would attempt to break the siege from outside. To prepare for this, he built a second line of fortifications, contravallation facing outward, designed to hold off any relief army. It was a gamble unlike any other. Caesar and his legions stood between two enemies, the besieged Gauls within and the vast Gallic coalition gathering beyond. If either side broke through, his army could be annihilated. Yet Caesar's confidence never wavered. He trusted in the discipline of his soldiers and the strength of Roman engineering. Inside Alesia, desperation grew. Supplies dwindled, and hunger gnawed at the defenders. Vercingetorix attempted sorties against the Roman lines, but each time, the legions repelled them with brutal efficiency. The double wall of fortifications held firm, a marvel of organization and determination. Then came the moment Caesar had predicted. A massive Gallic relief force, perhaps 200,000 strong, descended upon Alesia. The Roman legions now faced the nightmare scenario. Enemies attacking from within and without. The ground shook with the fury of simultaneous assaults. For days, the Romans fought on two fronts, their lines bending but never breaking. Caesar himself rode along the fortifications, rallying his men, reminding them that their survival and the glory of Rome depended on their courage. The climax came when the relief army launched a full-scale attack against a weak point in the Roman lines. At the same time, Vercingetorix led his warriors in a desperate charge from inside the fortress. Caesar's legions were nearly overwhelmed. Victory hung by a thread. In that critical moment, Caesar personally took command of the reserves, leading a counterattack that turned the tide. His presence electrified the soldiers, who fought with renewed ferocity. The relief army was driven back, and the defenders of Alesia, seeing their allies routed, retreated in despair. The siege had lasted weeks, but its outcome was decisive. The Gallic coalition collapsed, its greatest army shattered. Vercingetorix, realizing the hopelessness of further resistance, surrendered to Caesar. According to legend, he rode out of the fortress, cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, and knelt in defeat. The image of the proud Gallic king humbled before Rome became one of the defining symbols of Caesar's career. The victory at Alesia was more than a military triumph. It was a demonstration of Roman discipline, engineering, and endurance against overwhelming odds. It showcased Caesar's ability to foresee, prepare, and adapt with brilliance under pressure. Few generals in history could have conceived such a strategy, let alone executed it with success. For the Gauls, Alesia marked the end of large-scale resistance. Though pockets of rebellion would continue, the dream of a united Gaul free from Rome had died on that hilltop. For Caesar, the victory secured his place as one of the greatest generals of all time. His enemies in the Senate, who had doubted him, now had to acknowledge his genius 7, as they feared what it meant for the Republic. The siege of Alesia was not only the climax of the Gallic Wars, it was the moment when Julius Caesar's destiny became undeniable. He had conquered a people, subdued a land, and proven that no force could stand against the will of Rome under his command. With the surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia, Julius Caesar had accomplished what no Roman before him had dared to attempt: the complete subjugation of Gaul. After nearly a decade of relentless campaigns, victories, and bloodshed, the tribes of Gaul were broken, their lands incorporated into Rome's growing sphere of power. For Caesar, the Gallic Wars brought more than territory. They brought immense wealth, an unshakable reputation, and an army whose loyalty bordered on worship. The spoils of Gaul were staggering. Gold, silver, and countless slaves poured into Rome. Caesar used this wealth to settle his debts, reward his allies, and ensure the loyalty of his soldiers. The conquest transformed him from a man burdened with crippling loans into one of the richest figures in Rome. But more important than wealth was glory. His victories made him the most celebrated general of his age, a man spoken of in the same breath as Alexander the Great and Hannibal. Caesar carefully shaped how Rome perceived his achievements. His commentary De Bello Gallico, written as reports to the Senate, were widely circulated among the public. These accounts presented his campaigns as defensive wars, noble struggles to protect Roman allies against barbarian threats. In reality, they were wars of conquest, but Caesar's clear, direct prose made them accessible and persuasive. Romans who had never seen Gaul could picture the battles, the fortresses, and the courage of their legions. By controlling the narrative, Caesar ensured that his triumphs resonated not only with the Senate, but with the people. His soldiers, meanwhile, adored him. They had endured freezing winters, endless marches, and savage battles under his command. Yet Caesar shared in their hardships, rewarded their loyalty, and delivered them victories. They had become more than just an army of Rome, they had become Caesar's army. Their devotion to him personally was perhaps his greatest prize from the Gallic Wars. In years to come, when Caesar's path clashed with the Senate, it would be this loyalty that gave him the strength to defy the Republic. Rome responded to his victories with awe. In 46 BCE, after his eventual return from further campaigns, Caesar celebrated an unprecedented triple triumph in the capital. One for Gaul, one for Egypt, and one for Pompey. The streets of Rome were filled with parades, spoils, and captives. Among them, Vercingetorix, the proud Gallic king, who had once united his people against Rome, was paraded in chains before the cheering crowds. His execution symbolized not only the fall of Gaul, but the supremacy of Caesar. The triumph was more than a celebration, it was a display of power. It reminded the Roman people that Caesar was not just another general, but a man who had expanded Rome's borders farther than anyone in living memory. The Senate, forced to honor him, grew uneasy. They saw in his triumphs not only Rome's glory, but Caesar's growing dominance. For the ordinary citizens, however, Caesar was a hero. He brought wealth to the city, distributed gifts to the poor, and staged games and feasts of unparalleled splendor. The people adored him as the man who had made Rome richer and stronger, who had humbled barbarian kings and who treated even the humblest citizen with respect. His popularity soared, creating a base of support that no Senate decree could diminish. The conquest of Gaul also shifted the balance of power in the Republic. Pompey, once the unrivaled military hero, now found his fame eclipsed. Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate, had died in Parthia. With Gaul under his command, Caesar stood as the most powerful man in Rome. Yet this power brought him into direct conflict with the Senate, which feared that his legions and his ambition threatened the very survival of the Republic. For Caesar, however, the triumph was not the end, but a beginning. Gaul had given him everything he needed: wealth, soldiers, prestige, and the adoration of the masses. With these tools, he could challenge the Senate, outmaneuver Pompey, and shape Rome according to his vision. The Gallic wars had been brutal, leaving a trail of destruction and countless lives lost. But for Caesar, they were the crucible in which his destiny was forged. From the mud of Gaul emerged not just a conqueror, but a man who now seemed destined to reshape the entire world. By the end of the 50s BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the height of his power. His conquest of Gaul had made him the most celebrated general in Rome, the darling of the people, and the commander of a loyal, battle-hardened army. Yet with power came fear. In the marble halls of the Senate, whispers turned to open alarm. The senators, especially the optimates, saw in Caesar not a servant of the Republic, but a man too dangerous to be allowed unchecked. The death of Crassus in 53 BCE had shattered the balance of the first triumvirate. Without Crassus's wealth and influence, the fragile alliance between Caesar and Pompey began to unravel. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, and even his son-in-law, through the marriage to Julia, now drifted toward the Senate. Julia's death in childbirth had severed the family bond between the two men, and with Crassus gone, there was nothing left to hold them together but rivalry. The Senate courted Pompey, presenting him as the defender of the Republic against Caesar's growing power. Pompey accepted extraordinary commands, taking control of grain supplies and securing authority in Spain through depiates. He remained in Rome, positioning himself as the Senate's champion, while Caesar was still far away in Gaul. The stage was being set for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. At the heart of the conflict lay a single issue: Caesar's command and his immunity from prosecution. Under Roman law, a governor could not be prosecuted while in office. Caesar's conquests had won him immense wealth and glory, but they had also earned him bitter enemies in the Senate, who longed to drag him into court for alleged abuses of power. As long as he held a provincial command, he was untouchable. But his term was nearing its end. Caesar wanted to transition directly from his governorship in Gaul to another consulship in Rome, maintaining his immunity and securing his political dominance. The Senate, led by figures like Cato and the consul Marcellus, was determined to block him. They insisted he must disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, this was not merely an insult, it was a death sentence. Without office, he would face trial, ruin, and likely exile. The Senate's maneuvers grew more aggressive. In 50 BCE, they demanded that Caesar relinquish his command. Caesar countered with offers of compromise. He would disarm if Pompey did the same. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey's growing alignment with them, rejected the deal. They believed that Caesar, isolated and far from Rome, could be forced into submission. But they had underestimated him. Caesar had something more powerful than senatorial decrees: the loyalty of his legions. These men had followed him through Gaul, endured hardship, and grown rich from conquest. Their allegiance was not to the Senate, but to Caesar personally. When he asked for their support, they gave it without hesitation. In January of 49 BCE, the Senate took the final step. Under pressure from Pompey and Caesar's enemies, they passed the Senatus Consultum, the ultimate decree declaring Caesar an enemy of the state if he did not disband his army. It was, effectively, a declaration of war. The Republic stood on the brink of collapse. Two giants, Caesar and Pompey, once allies, now faced each other as rivals. The Senate believed the law and tradition would restrain Caesar. But Caesar was not a man bound by tradition. He was a man of destiny, and he would not walk willingly into ruin. The tension was unbearable. Rome waited, watching the northern frontier, wondering whether Caesar would obey the Senate or defy it. The next move would determine the fate of the Republic. In the winter of 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at a crossroads, both literal and figurative. Behind him lay years of conquest, the loyalty of his legions, and a reputation unmatched in Rome. Before him lay the Rubicon, a small river marking the boundary between his provincial command in Cisalpine Gaul and the Italian heartland. To cross it with his army would be to break Roman law, an act of open rebellion against the Senate. To remain behind would mean surrender, humiliation, and likely destruction. The Senate had issued its ultimatum. Caesar must disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. To obey was to walk into the hands of his enemies, stripped of power and vulnerable to prosecution. To resist was to ignite a civil war. The decision weighed heavily. But Caesar was not a man to let fear dictate his course. He knew the stakes. If he crossed, he would be branded a traitor. But if he hesitated, all he had built could crumble. On a cold January night, Caesar gathered his closest officers. He laid out the situation plainly. The Senate, allied with Pompey, had pushed him to the brink. Rome itself was in the grip of fear, torn between loyalty to tradition and the charisma of its greatest general. The legions, weary but fiercely loyal, awaited his command. After a moment of silence, Caesar is said to have spoken words that would echo through history. Alea, Iacta, est the die is cast. With that declaration, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. It was a symbolic act as much as a military one. The Rubicon was not a wide river, but its crossing marked the point of no return. Caesar had defied the Senate and taken his fate and Rome's into his own hands. The news spread quickly. Panic gripped Rome as word arrived that Caesar was marching south. The Senate, unprepared for his boldness, reacted with chaos. Pompey, entrusted with the defense of the Republic, realized he had neither the forces nor the preparation to stop Caesar immediately. Though Pompey had influence and resources, his legions were scattered, many stationed in distant provinces. Caesar, by contrast, had a disciplined army at his back, ready to march at a moment's notice. What made Caesar's decision so extraordinary was the speed and confidence with which he acted. Civil wars are often preceded by hesitation, but Caesar wasted no time. He advanced rapidly, seizing towns and gaining support as he moved. In many places, he was welcomed as a liberator rather than resisted as a rebel. The common people remembered his generosity, his games, and his reforms. To them, Caesar was not an enemy of the Republic, but a champion against the corruption of the Senate. Yet Caesar's move was not only about speed, it was also about psychology. By crossing the Rubicon, he had forced his opponents into a dilemma. They could either confront him unprepared, risking defeat, or retreat and concede the initiative. Pompey chose the latter. Believing he could regroup and gather stronger forces in the east, he abandoned Rome and withdrew to southern Italy. The Senate followed him, leaving the capital vulnerable. For Caesar, this was a stunning victory without a battle. By the mere act of marching, he had seized the heart of the Republic. The Senate's flight made him appear strong, while his enemies seemed weak and disorganized. His gamble had paid off, at least for the moment. Still, Caesar knew the war had only begun. Pompey remained a formidable rival, with access to fleets, wealth, and allies across the Mediterranean. But Caesar's boldness had given him the advantage of momentum. He now controlled Italy, the center of Roman power, and the loyalty of his legions was unshaken. The crossing of the Rubicon became more than an event, it became a symbol. It represented the moment when ambition overcame tradition, when a single man challenged the authority of the Republic itself. For centuries to come, the phrase would be invoked whenever someone made an irreversible decision, a step that changed the course of history. For Caesar, it was both a risk and a necessity. He had thrown the dice, and now he would see where fortune carried him. Rome was no longer governed by laws, and Decisive was at the mercy of generals and their armies. The Republic had entered a new and dangerous chapter, and at its center stood Julius Caesar, striding forward with destiny at his heels. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in January of 49 BCE, he did more than defy the Senate. He unleashed a storm that would consume the Republic. His decision set in motion a series of events that could not be undone. What followed was not a cautious advance, but a rapid, almost theatrical march toward Rome. One that revealed both the weakness of his enemies and the brilliance of his strategy. Caesar began with only a single legion, the 13th. To many, it might have seemed reckless to challenge the Senate and Pompeius' authority with so small a force. But Caesar understood the psychology of power. His reputation, forged in the fires of Gaul, carried as much weight as his soldiers' swords. Each town and city he approached had to decide: resist and face destruction, or open their gates to the man hailed as Rome's greatest general. Most chose the latter. As Caesar advanced, his army grew. Additional legions, stationed in nearby provinces, joined him, swelling his ranks. Local communities provided supplies, often eagerly, seeing in Caesar a protector against the Senate's aristocratic dominance. His propaganda, carefully honed in his commentaries, had portrayed him as the defender of the people. And now that image paid dividends. He was not seen as a rebel, but as a savior, returning to claim his rightful place. Meanwhile, panic gripped Rome. The Senate, unprepared for Caesar's speed, scrambled to respond. Pompey, nominally the Republic's champion, realized with growing alarm that he could not defend the city. His legions were scattered across distant provinces, and those in Italy were few and poorly trained. Confronting Caesar with such forces risked disaster. Rather than gamble everything on an unprepared defense, Pompey chose withdrawal. It was a stunning decision. Pompey and the Senate fled southward to Capua, then further to Brandisium on the Adriatic coast, where they could regroup and secure reinforcements from the east. In their haste, they abandoned Rome itself, leaving its people vulnerable and its institutions leaderless. To Caesar, this was an opportunity of immense symbolic value. By marching into Rome unopposed, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a man welcomed by the city he claimed to serve. When Caesar entered Rome, there was no battle, no bloodshed. The streets were tense, filled with uncertainty, but there was no resistance. The absence of the Senate and Pompey's flight gave Caesar an aura of legitimacy. He promised order, stability, and continuity of government. He assured the people that he sought not tyranny, but justice. His actions reinforced his carefully cultivated image. Caesar was not the aggressor, but the man forced into action by his enemy's arrogance. Yet Caesar was not blinded by the ease of his success. He knew Pompey remained a formidable opponent. with access to fleets, vast resources, and allies in the east. The war was far from over, but by seizing Rome without a fight, he had struck a psychological blow. The Senate appeared weak, Pompey indecisive, and Caesar unstoppable. To consolidate his position, Caesar acted swiftly. He secured the state treasury, ensuring he had the funds to pay his soldiers and continue the war effort. He moved to stabilize administration in Rome, presenting himself as a guardian of the Republic rather than its destroyer. Every step was calculated to reassure citizens while undermining his enemies. The march on Rome also demonstrated Caesar's mastery of timing. By acting with speed, he denied Pompey the chance to rally forces in Italy. By avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, he strengthened his image as a leader who fought reluctantly, compelled by circumstances rather than ambition. In reality, Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. He had seized the heart of the Republic with minimal cost, and in doing so, set the stage for the greater battles to come. For the Senate and Pompey, retreat was humiliating. They had expected Caesar to hesitate, to falter under the weight of tradition and law. Instead, he moved with the decisiveness of a man who understood that fortune favors the bold. Their flight left them scrambling to reassemble power, while Caesar enjoyed the prestige of swift, bloodless victory. The march on Rome was more than a military maneuver, it was a political masterpiece. By the time Caesar arrived in the capital, he was no longer just a general with an army. He was the master of Rome itself. Yet he knew that this was only the beginning. Pompey had not been defeated, only displaced. The Senate had not surrendered, only fled. The true test would come in the battles that lay ahead. Battles that would pit Caesar against his former ally in a struggle for the soul of the Republic. But for now, Caesar had accomplished the unthinkable. With a single legion and the force of his will, he had marched into Rome and claimed control without spilling Roman blood. It was an achievement that revealed the depth of his genius and the fragility of the Republic. The die had been cast at the Rubicon, and with each step toward Rome, Caesar proved that he was ready to play out the game to its end. The march on Rome had given Julius Caesar control of the capital, but it did not resolve the conflict. His greatest rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey the Great, remained at large, and the Senate rallied around him. What made this confrontation so momentous was that Caesar and Pompey had not always been enemies. Once, they had been allies bound by marriage and political ambition. Their transformation from friends to rivals was both tragic and inevitable, driven by ambition, circumstance, and the fragile state of the Republic. Years earlier, Pompey and Caesar had formed part of the First Triumvirate, the alliance that dominated Roman politics. Pompey brought military prestige, Caesar brought popular support, and Crassus supplied wealth. Their partnership reshaped Rome, and to cement it, Caesar had given his beloved daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey. By most accounts, theirs was a marriage of genuine affection, a rare warmth in the cold world of Roman politics. Julia's presence softened the rivalry between the two men, keeping their ambitions in balance. But fate intervened. Julia died in childbirth in 54 BCE, and with her death, the bond between Caesar and Pompey dissolved. Crassus soon followed, killed in the disastrous Parthian campaign at Carrhae in 53 BCE. The triumvirate collapsed, leaving Caesar and Pompey as the two towering figures of Rome. Their ambitions, once aligned, now stood in opposition. Pompey drifted toward the Senate and the Optimates, the conservative faction that had long despised Caesar. He accepted extraordinary powers and positioned himself as the defender of the Republic against Caesar's growing influence. To the Senate, Pompey was the safer choice, a man of immense military experience, who, despite his ambition, seemed more controllable than Caesar. To Pompey himself, the Senate's support offered legitimacy, a chance to stand as Rome's guardian rather than its destroyer. Yet Pompey underestimated Caesar's resolve. He believed that Caesar's power was fragile, dependent on his army in Gaul. He assumed that once faced with united senatorial opposition, Caesar would yield. But Caesar, as the crossing of the Rubicon had proven, was no ordinary rival. He acted boldly, swiftly, and without hesitation, seizing Rome before Pompey could mount a defense. The rivalry between the two men was not merely political, it was deeply personal. Pompey had once been the darling of Rome. Celebrated for his victories against pirates, and in the East, he had been hailed as the new Alexander. But by the late 50s, his glory had begun to fade. Caesar's triumphs in Gaul eclipsed his own, and the people shifted their admiration to the younger general whose victories seemed endless. To Pompey, Caesar's rise was not only a threat to the Republic, it was an insult to his legacy. Caesar, for his part, admired Pompey's talents, but resented his alignment with the Senate. He saw in Pompey not only a rival, but a man who had betrayed their earlier partnership. Their friendship had once been genuine, but in the ruthless world of Roman politics, friendship was fragile when weighed against ambition. By early 49 BCE, the two men stood on opposite sides of a fractured republic. Pompey, with the Senate at his back, withdrew to the east, where he could draw on vast resources and loyal legions. Caesar, controlling Rome and Italy, prepared to pursue him. Both men knew that the struggle between them would not be resolved in speeches or decrees. It would be decided on the battlefield. The civil war that now loomed was unlike any Rome had seen. It was not Rome against foreign enemies, but Roman against Roman, legion against legion, general against general. The Senate could call it a defense of the Republic, and Caesar could claim he fought for justice, but in truth, it was a contest of power between two of the greatest men of their age. For Caesar, the stakes were survival. To surrender meant ruin, trial, and death. For Pompey, the stakes were legacy. To lose meant seeing his glory eclipsed by the man he once called an ally. Both men carried the weight of destiny, and both believed Rome's future depended on their victory. Thus, friends had become rivals, and rivals would soon become enemies locked in a struggle that would shake the Republic to its core. The civil war was no longer a possibility, was reality, and the world held its breath as Caesar prepared to march against the man once known as the Great. The rivalry between Julius Caesar and Pompey could not be contained by politics or compromise. By 48 BCE, the two greatest men of Rome stood on opposite sides of a civil war that had engulfed the Republic. After months of maneuvering, their struggle reached its climax on the plains of Pharsalus in central Greece. The battle that followed would not only decide the fate of the two generals, but alter the course of Roman history forever. Pompey held the advantage in numbers. His army, supported by the Senate and bolstered by allies from the eastern provinces, numbered nearly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar, by contrast, commanded roughly 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Force barely half the size of his rivals. Pompey's position seemed unassailable. He had the Senate's backing, superior numbers, and the aura of legitimacy. Many believed Caesar had finally overreached, that his boldness had brought him to the brink of ruin. Yet Caesar possessed qualities that could not be measured merely in numbers: experience, discipline, and the unwavering loyalty of his men. His legions were veterans of Gaul, hardened by years of brutal campaigns. They had faced desperate odds before and triumphed. Caesar himself radiated confidence. reminding his soldiers that they had beaten the Gauls, the Germans, and countless others. Why should Romans be different? The armies met on a broad plain near the river Inipius. Pompey, advised by senators and generals eager for glory, devised a plan to use his cavalry to overwhelm Caesar's right flank. With superior numbers of horsemen, he hoped to rout Caesar's smaller cavalry, circle behind his lines, and crush his army from the rear. It was a sound strategy, and on paper it seemed certain to succeed. But Caesar anticipated the move. He knew Pompey would rely on his cavalry's superiority. To counter it, he placed a hidden reserve of 6 cohorts around, 2,000 of his toughest legionaries behind his right flank. These men were instructed not to charge as cavalry would, but to aim their pila, heavy Roman javelins, directly at the faces of the enemy horsemen. It was an unorthodox tactic, but one that exploited the vulnerability of cavalry against disciplined infantry. The battle began with the thunder of drums and the clash of steel. Pompey's infantry held their ground, waiting for Caesar's legions to tire themselves with a long advance. Caesar's men, however, paused mid-march to rest and reform, showing their discipline before resuming their advance in perfect order. The clash of infantry was fierce, but evenly matched. The real test came on the flanks. Pompey unleashed his cavalry in a sweeping charge against Caesar's right. Thousands of horsemen thundered forward, confident of victory. Caesar's smaller cavalry began to give way, luring the enemy closer. Then, at the critical moment, Caesar gave the signal. The 6 hidden cohorts surged forward, hurling their pila into the faces of the charging cavalry. Horses panicked, riders reeled, and chaos spread. The Gallic and Eastern horsemen broke under the unexpected onslaught, fleeing the field. With Pompey's cavalry routed, Caesar's right flank was secure. His reserve cohorts wheeled around and attacked Pompey's infantry from the side. At the same time, Caesar ordered a full assault across the line. His legions, disciplined and relentless, pressed forward with unstoppable force. Pompey's men, deprived of cavalry support, began to waver. The collapse came swiftly. Caesar's soldiers broke through, encircling their enemies. Panic spread among Pompey's ranks, and what had begun as a disciplined stand turned into a desperate flight. Thousands were cut down as they fled, and the plain was littered with bodies. The might of the Senate's army had been shattered in a single afternoon. Pompey himself watched in despair as his army disintegrated. Unable to rally his men, he fled the battlefield, riding away in disguise. For Caesar, it was a victory of genius. Strategy, discipline, and timing had triumphed over numbers and caution. In the aftermath, Caesar showed his customary blend of mercy and pragmatism. Many captured senators and officers were pardoned, allowed to return to Rome under his protection. He knew clemency could turn enemies into supporters and strengthen his image as a leader of vision, not vengeance. Yet the war was not over. Pompey had escaped, and Caesar knew he would seek refuge and regroup elsewhere. Still, Pharsalus was decisive. In one stroke, Caesar had destroyed the Senate's army, broken Pompey's prestige, and made himself the undisputed master of Rome. The Republic, as it had once existed, was gone, replaced by the will of one man whose star seemed destined never to fall. But destiny has a way of turning. As Caesar prepared to pursue Pompey to the east, events would soon carry both men to Egypt, where the story would take a dramatic and unexpected turn. After the crushing defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Pompey the Great fled the battlefield, his once mighty reputation in tatters. The man hailed as Rome's champion, the conqueror of the East, was now a fugitive. He travelled first to the coast, boarding a ship with a small retinue of loyal followers. His destination was uncertain, but his hope was clear: to find refuge, raise new forces, and continue the fight against Caesar. Pompey still had resources. He retained influence in the eastern provinces, and many kings and client states owed him favors. He could have sailed to Asia Minor or to Parthia, where Rome's enemies might have welcomed him as a valuable ally. But Pompey chose Egypt, a wealthy kingdom in political turmoil. He believed Egypt's rulers, indebted to him for his past support, would provide sanctuary. It was a fatal miscalculation. At this time, Egypt was ruled by the young Ptolemy XIII, a boy king whose reign was dominated by advisors and embroiled in a bitter civil war with his sister, Cleopatra VII. The kingdom was unstable, and the presence of a Roman civil war spilling onto its shores only deepened the crisis. When Pompey's ship anchored off the coast near Pelusium, Ptolemy's court faced a dilemma. Should they welcome the defeated Roman general or betray him to Caesar? The decision was guided by fear. Ptolemy's advisors reasoned that Caesar was the rising power, the man who had just crushed the Senate's armies. To support Pompey was to invite Caesar's wrath. To betray Pompey was to win Caesar's favor. Seeking to secure their position, they chose treachery. On September 28, 48 BCE, Pompey was invited to come ashore under the guise of friendship. A small boat approached his vessel, carrying men he believed were allies. Among them was a Roman officer who had once served under him, a cruel reassurance that trust was possible. Pompey, weary and resigned, stepped into the boat. As his wife Cornelia and his companions watched anxiously from the ship, the boat rowed toward the Egyptian shore. But as Pompey rose to disembark, the betrayal was revealed. He was stabbed and struck down before he could defend himself. The man who had once commanded Rome's legions, who had triumphed across the Mediterranean, died helplessly in the surf of a foreign land. His head was severed, his body left on the shore, abandoned like that of a common criminal. Cornelia, watching from the ship, cried out in horror as she realized what had happened. The scene was tragic, humiliating, and unworthy of the man who had once been called Magnus the Great. When Caesar arrived in Egypt days later, the assassins presented him with Pompey's head, expecting gratitude. But Caesar did not smile. Instead, he wept. Though they had been rivals and enemies, Caesar respected Pompey as a great Roman, a man who had shared in the ruling of the Republic and whose fall marked the end of an era. Caesar ordered that Pompey's remains be given proper burial rites, honoring him as one who had once been Rome's greatest son. The death of Pompey symbolized more than the end of a man. It marked the collapse of the old Republic's balance of power. For decades, Rome had been shaped by the rivalries of its greatest generals Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Crassus, Caesar and Pompey. Now, with Pompey gone, Caesar stood alone at the pinnacle of Roman power. Yet Egypt, where Pompey met his tragic end, would not be a place of peace for Caesar. Instead, it would plunge him into new intrigues, entangling him in the civil war between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra. The death of Pompey was both a conclusion and a beginning, the end of Caesar's greatest rivalry, and the start of his fateful entanglement with the Queen of the Nile. For Rome, Pompey's death was a turning point. The Senate's champion was gone, the Republic weakened beyond repair. Caesar had triumphed not just on the battlefield, but in the struggle for supremacy. Yet even in victory, he showed a humanity that few expected, mourning the man who had once been his friend, his ally, and his rival. Pompey's life ended in betrayal, but his shadow lingered. His fall cleared the way for Caesar, but it also reminded Rome of the price of ambition in a republic tearing itself apart. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in October of 48 BCE, he carried the weight of triumph and tragedy. He had pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, only to find his rival murdered on Egyptian shores. Though victorious, Caesar was unsettled. Pompey's death had denied him the satisfaction of defeating his great rival in person. Worse, it had plunged him into the volatile politics of Egypt, a kingdom torn apart by civil war. Egypt was one of the richest lands in the ancient world, famed for its fertile Nile, bustling cities, and immense grain supplies upon which Rome increasingly relied. Its throne was contested by two siblings of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the young King Ptolemy XIII and his elder sister, Cleopatra VII. According to Egyptian custom, they had been married as corollers, but in practice, they were bitter enemies. Cleopatra, ambitious and intelligent, had been driven into exile by Ptolemy's advisors. She now gathered forces on Egypt's borders, waiting for her chance to reclaim power. Caesar, arriving with a modest force, found himself in a delicate position. He had no wish to become embroiled in Egypt's dynastic struggles, yet the country was too important to ignore. Grain shipments from Egypt fed Rome, and control of the Nile meant influence over the Mediterranean. To stabilize the kingdom and secure his own authorities, Caesar declared that he would mediate between the rival siblings, enforcing their father's will that they rule jointly. But Cleopatra was not about to entrust her fate to negotiations dominated by her enemies. Instead, she chose a path as daring as it was legendary. According to tradition, she arranged to be smuggled into Caesar's quarters in the royal palace, wrapped in a carpet or linen sack. When she was unrolled before him, she revealed herself not only as a political player, but as a woman of extraordinary charm, wit, and presence. Cleopatra was unlike anyone Caesar had met. She was young, just 21 years old, but her intelligence and charisma were formidable. Fluent in several languages, versed in philosophy and politics, she possessed a magnetism that captivated those around her. For Caesar, weary from years of war and rivalry, her arrival was electrifying. He was struck not only by her beauty, but by her confidence, her boldness in seizing the moment. The two quickly formed an alliance, both political and personal. Cleopatra saw in Caesar the means to reclaim her throne. Caesar saw in Cleopatra both a partner and a symbol. By supporting her, he could secure Egypt, one of the richest kingdoms in the world, and present himself as the arbiter of dynasties as well as republics. Their relationship, controversial in Rome, would become one of the most famous unions in history. The presence of Cleopatra at Caesar's side enraged Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. They had hoped to use Caesar as a pawn against their sister. Instead, Caesar had chosen her. Open conflict was now inevitable. Caesar demanded that Ptolemy restore Cleopatra to her position as co-ruler. Ptolemy refused, rallying his forces and preparing to drive both Caesar and Cleopatra from Alexandria. For Caesar, the situation was precarious. He had only a small contingent of Roman troops with him, far fewer than the armies Ptolemy could muster. Yet Caesar was not a man easily intimidated. He fortified his position in the palace district, secured control of the harbor, and prepared for war. Once again, he would rely on discipline, cunning, and the element of surprise to outmaneuver a larger enemy. But in these first days in Alexandria, beyond the political maneuvering and military calculations, a partnership was born. Cleopatra had found in Caesar the protector who could restore her throne. Caesar had found in Cleopatra a queen whose ambition matched his own. Together, they would change not only the fate of Egypt, but the destiny of Rome itself. The sands of the Nile now became the stage for a new drama. Caesar had come to Egypt in pursuit of Pompey. Instead, he had found Cleopatra, a queen who would bind his name to hers for eternity. The alliance between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra set Egypt ablaze both figuratively and literally. What began as a political maneuver quickly escalated into one of the most dangerous sieges of Caesar's career. The war in Alexandria. The young Ptolemy XIII, outraged by Caesar's support for his sister, rallied his advisors and declared war on the intruders. Alexandria, a city of splendor and wealth, became a battlefield. At first glance, Caesar's position seemed perilous. He had brought only a modest force to Egypt, numbering perhaps 4,000 soldiers. Against him stood tens of thousands of Egyptians loyal to Ptolemy, backed by ships and fortified positions. Caesar and Cleopatra, entrenched in the royal palace district, found themselves besieged, cut off from much of the city and dependent on the harbor for supplies. But Caesar was no stranger to desperate situations. He fortified his positions, secured the palace quarter, and placed barricades at key streets. His small force, though outnumbered, was disciplined and seasoned. The Egyptians, though numerous, lacked the cohesion of Roman legions. Caesar knew that with clever tactics, he could hold out long enough for reinforcements. The struggle for control of Alexandria turned into a brutal urban war. Streets once filled with scholars, merchants, and philosophers became killing grounds. Roman legionaries fought hand-to-hand against Egyptian soldiers amid temples and marble colonnades. The harbor became another front, with naval skirmishes raging as both sides sought control of supply lines. It was during one of these naval clashes that tragedy struck. Caesar, seeking to deny Ptolemy's forces access to the fleet, ordered ships in the harbor set ablaze. The fire spread uncontrollably, leaping from vessel to vessel and eventually reaching parts of the city. Among the structures consumed was the great library of Alexandria, the legendary repository of ancient knowledge. Scrolls collected from across the known world were lost to the flames, a catastrophe that echoed through history, though the exact scale of the destruction remains debated. The image of Caesar's war engulfing the library became a lasting symbol of cultural loss. Despite setbacks, Caesar adapted with brilliance. He used the geography of the city to his advantage, building walls within walls, creating layered defenses. When Egyptian forces attempted to cut off his water supply, Caesar dug wells and secured alternate routes. He kept morale high among his men with speeches, reminding them that survival meant not only their own safety, but the survival of Rome's honor. Cleopatra, though not commanding troops, played a crucial role. Her presence symbolized legitimacy for Caesar's cause in Egypt. Many Egyptians, disillusioned with Ptolemy's advisors, saw in her a rightful ruler who could restore stability. Her alliance with Caesar gave her not only protection, but a pathway back to power. The turning point came with the arrival of Roman reinforcements. Caesar's allies in Asia Minor and Syria dispatched troops and ships, swelling his strength. With fresh forces, he broke the siege lines and launched counterattacks. Ptolemy's army was forced into retreat, their numbers dwindling under the relentless pressure of disciplined legions. In the chaos of the fighting near the Nile, Ptolemy XIII himself attempted to flee. Accounts suggest that his boat capsized in the river and the young king drowned, ending his short and turbulent reign. His death removed the last major obstacle to Cleopatra's restoration. The war had ravaged Alexandria, scarred its people, and left ruins smoldering where culture had once flourished. Yet for Caesar, it was a triumph. Against overwhelming odds, he had not only survived, but secured victory. For Cleopatra, it was the turning point of her life. With her brother dead, she could reclaim Egypt's throne, this time under Caesar's patronage. But the war in Alexandria was more than a struggle for a kingdom. It was a demonstration of Caesar's resilience and determination. Outnumbered, stranded in a foreign city, and beset by enemies, he had once again proven that fortune favored the bold. Where others might have surrendered, Caesar endured, and in doing so, bound his fate ever closer to that of Cleopatra. The death of Ptolemy XIII in the Nile ended Egypt's civil war and secured Julius Caesar's position as kingmaker in the ancient world. With her brother gone, Cleopatra VII was restored to the throne. She ruled officially alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, in keeping with dynastic custom. But, in practice, she stood as the true power of Egypt thanks to Caesar's support. For Cleopatra, this was more than a political restoration. It was a personal triumph. Exiled, betrayed, and nearly destroyed, she had gambled everything on her alliance with Caesar and won. She returned to Alexandria not as a fugitive but as queen, her authority reinforced by Rome's greatest general. For Caesar, the outcome was equally advantageous. By placing Cleopatra on the throne, he secured Rome's influence over Egypt and guaranteed the flow of grain shipments vital to the Republic. Their partnership, however, extended beyond politics. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, a relationship that scandalized Rome but fascinated the world. Cleopatra soon bore him a son, Ptolemy XV Philometor Caesar, popularly known as Caesarion Little Caesar. Though Caesar never formally acknowledged him as his heir, the boy embodied the union of two great powers, Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra, intelligent and ambitious, understood the value of spectacle. Together with Caesar, she staged grand processions and ceremonies, presenting herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the Egyptian goddess. With Caesar at her side, she projected an image of divine legitimacy, weaving Roman power into Egyptian tradition. For Caesar, this association enhanced his aura of greatness, portraying him as a figure whose influence transcended nations. Yet Caesar could not linger in Egypt indefinitely. The Republic still seethed with conflict, and Pompey's allies remained at large. Even as he celebrated victory in Alexandria, news arrived of new threats. In Asia Minor, King Pharnakes II of Pontus, son of the infamous Mithridates the Great, had exploited the chaos of Rome's civil war to expand his territory. Caesar, determined to reassert Roman authority, set out to confront him. Cleopatra accompanied him partway, and their bond endured even as Caesar marched eastward. For her, his presence had restored her throne and secured Egypt's independence under Roman protection. For him, she remained a symbol of his expanding influence. Their relationship, half political, half personal, would leave a mark on history that echoed for centuries. Caesar's eastern campaign was swift and decisive. Pharnakes believed Caesar, distracted by civil war, could be defeated. But Caesar, though outnumbered, struck with characteristic speed. At the Battle of Zela in 47 BCE, he annihilated Pharnakes' forces in a matter of hours. The victory was so rapid and complete that Caesar summarized it in 3 immortal words: Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. The phrase captured more than a battlefield triumph. It encapsulated Caesar's entire approach to power, bold, direct, and overwhelming. No hesitation, no drawn-out campaigns. Just swift, decisive action that left no doubt of his supremacy. With the East secured and Pharnax defeated, Caesar turned his attention back to Rome, where unfinished struggles awaited. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra consolidated her rule. With Caesar's blessing, she reigned as queen, continuing to strengthen Egypt's economy and cultural splendor. Her reign, however, was forever tied to her Roman protector, Caesar's enemies in the Senate whispered that he had been seduced, that he had traded Rome's honor for the charms of a foreign queen. Yet the truth was simpler. Cleopatra and Caesar were both ambitious visionaries who saw in one another the means to achieve greatness. For Caesar, Egypt had been both a detour and a revelation. He had pursued Pompey to Alexandria and found not only victory but an ally whose legend would intertwine with his own. He had faced siege, fire, and treachery, yet emerged stronger than ever. His eastern campaigns had reminded the world that Rome's power was undiminished, even amid civil war. When Caesar finally departed Egypt in 47 BCE, he left behind Cleopatra on her throne and his own legacy embedded in the Nile's ancient sands. He returned to Rome not just as a conqueror of Gaul and a victor in civil war, but as a man whose influence stretched from the Tiber to the Nile, from the Alps to the Euphrates. But triumph abroad could not silence the turmoil at home. The Senate remained divided, Pompey's allies still plotted, and Rome itself trembled under the weight of Caesar's growing dominance. The Queen of Egypt had been restored, but for Caesar, the greatest battles and the gravest dangers lay ahead. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BCE, he was no longer just a victorious general. He was the master of the Roman world. Years of civil war had destroyed his rivals. Pompey was dead, his supporters scattered, and his enemies either pardoned or powerless. He had triumphed in Gaul, in Egypt, and in the East. His soldiers adored him, the people cheered him, and the Senate, cowed into submission, granted him unprecedented honors. Rome had seen powerful generals before, but never had one man dominated so completely. Caesar's return was marked by spectacle on a scale the Republic had never witnessed. He celebrated a series of triumphs, the grand parades awarded to Rome's greatest victors. 4 separate triumphs were held, each commemorating a different campaign: Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. The streets of Rome filled with cheering crowds as Caesar rode in a gilded chariot, displaying the spoils of his conquests. Prisoners of war, exotic animals, and mountains of treasure paraded before the people. Among the captives was the young Arsinoe, Cleopatra's sister, paraded through the streets in chains, a symbol of Egypt's submission to Caesar's will. The triumphs were not just celebrations, they were demonstrations of power. They reminded the people of Caesar's conquests, his wealth, and his destiny. Yet not everyone rejoiced. Some senators watched uneasily, seeing in the spectacles not the honor of the Republic, but the glorification of a single man. Rome had been built on shared power, on the principle that no one individual could dominate. Now, that principle seemed to crumble before their eyes. Caesar understood the importance of image. He showered the people with feasts, games, and distributions of grain. He paid his soldiers generously, ensuring their loyalty. He forgave many of his enemies, pardoning those who had fought against him at Pharsalus. To the public, he appeared as a magnanimous victor, a man who sought reconciliation rather than revenge. This policy of clemency, though strategic, earned him admiration and reinforced his image as a leader who stood above petty feuds. But beneath the surface of generosity lay the reality of Caesar's power. The Senate, weakened and divided, had little choice but to comply with his wishes. He was appointed dictator, first for short terms, then for 10 years, and eventually for life. Though he maintained the outward forms of the republic elections, assemblies, senatorial debates, the truth was clear. Caesar ruled Rome as a monarch in all but name. His dominance extended beyond politics. He restructured the calendar, introducing the Julian calendar, which would endure for centuries. He initiated vast building projects, employed thousands of workers, and reformed the distribution of grain and land. To many citizens, his rule brought stability after years of chaos. To the aristocracy, however, it was a chilling sign that the Republic's freedoms were dying. Caesar's return also brought personal complexities. Cleopatra traveled to Rome with their son, Caesarion, and resided in a villa across the Tiber. Their presence scandalized Roman society. While Caesar never openly acknowledged Caesarion as his heir, his relationship with Cleopatra fueled rumors and resentment. Many senators feared that Caesar dreamed not only of kingship in Rome, but of founding a dynasty that blended Roman and Egyptian power. The contrast between Caesar's popularity among the people and the unease among the Senate defined this period. To the masses, he was a hero, the man who had ended civil war and restored order. To the elite, he was a tyrant in waiting, a man whose ambition threatened the very foundations of the Republic. The tension grew with every new honor the Senate bestowed upon him, honors they gave out of fear rather than loyalty. As Caesar basked in his victories and shaped Rome to his vision, the seeds of conspiracy were already being planted. The senators, who had once bowed to his power, began to whisper among themselves. They saw his triumphs not as celebrations, but as coronations. They feared that the Republic, once a system of shared governance, had become the possession of one man. For Caesar, however, the future seemed secure. He had risen from debtor to dictator, from politician to conqueror, from exile's risk to master of Rome. He believed himself favored by fortune, destined to reshape the world. What he did not see or chose to ignore was that his very success was creating the enemies who would conspire to end his life. As dictator of Rome, Julius Caesar faced a challenge greater than any battlefield, governing a republic that no longer functioned. Civil wars, corruption, and inequality had hollowed out its institutions. Caesar understood that if he was to secure his power and stabilize the state, he needed more than military victories. He needed reforms. His actions would reshape Rome's economy, society, and political system, leaving a legacy that endured long after his death. One of his most lasting achievements was the reform of the calendar. The old Roman calendar, manipulated by politicians for electoral advantage, had become hopelessly misaligned with the seasons. Caesar, drawing on Egyptian astronomy, introduced the Julian calendar, a solar-based system with 365 days and a leap year every 4 years. This reform brought order to time itself, aligning festivals and agricultural cycles with precision. The Julian calendar, with minor adjustments, remains the basis of our modern calendar today. Economically, Caesar sought to address Rome's deep inequalities. He passed laws to reduce debt, easing the burden on poorer citizens without alienating wealthy creditors entirely. He limited the practice of hoarding wealth and encouraged investment in land and production. To alleviate poverty, he launched colonization programs, resettling veterans and landless citizens in new territories across the empire. These colonies not only relieved pressure in Rome, but spread Roman culture and influence into distant provinces. In the city itself, Caesar embarked on ambitious public works projects. He rebuilt temples, expanded the Forum, and began constructing the massive Forum Julium as a symbol of his rule. Roads, aqueducts, and harbors were improved, creating jobs and beautifying Rome. To the people, these works were tangible proof that Caesar's leadership brought prosperity. To the Senate, they were ominous monuments of personal power, overshadowing the Republic's traditions. Politically, Caesar centralized authority in ways that alarmed the aristocracy. He increased the size of the Senate to 900 members, filling it with his supporters and loyal provincials. In doing so, he diluted the influence of the old elite, while elevating new men who owed their positions to him. He also controlled elections, ensuring that magistrates loyal to him held key offices. Though republican forms remained in place, the reality was clear. Power flowed through Caesar. His citizenship reforms extended rights to communities across Gaul, Spain, and beyond. By broadening the base of Roman citizenship, Caesar integrated conquered peoples into the Republic, creating loyalty and expanding Rome's sense of identity. This inclusive policy helped stabilize the empire, but it also angered traditionalists who saw it as diluting Rome's heritage. Caesar also tackled corruption in the provinces. Governors, long notorious for extorting wealth from subject peoples, were now held to stricter standards. Caesar reduced opportunities for graft and demanded greater accountability. While this improved administration, it further alienated senators accustomed to enriching themselves at provincial expense. But the most controversial aspect of Caesar's rule was the concentration of personal power. He accepted titles and honors that bordered on monarchy. He was named Dictator for 10 years, then for life. His image appeared on coins, a privilege once reserved for gods and the Republic itself. Statues were erected in his honor, and he was granted the right to wear the purple robe and laurel wreath of triumph whenever he wished. To many Romans, these were unmistakable signs of kingship. Caesar, however, rejected the title of king when offered. He understood the Roman hatred of monarchy, rooted in the expulsion of the Tarquin kings centuries earlier. Yet his behavior, his dominance of politics, his personal cult, his disregard for senatorial tradition fed the perception that he sought to become king in all but name. At the same time, Caesar continued his policy of clemency. Former enemies were pardoned, restored to office, and even welcomed into his circle. This mercy won him admirers, but also fueled suspicion. Some believed his clemency was not genuine forgiveness, but arrogance, the indulgence of a man so powerful he could afford to spare those who opposed him. Among the pardoned were men who would later conspire against him. Caesar's reforms brought stability, prosperity, and efficiency to a republic long paralyzed by corruption and infighting. To the common people, he was a savior. To the Senate, he was a tyrant in disguise. The republic's old institutions still existed, but they were hollow shells. Real power rested with Caesar, and the senators knew it. His rule, though brilliant, sowed the seeds of his downfall. By concentrating authority, by reshaping Rome in his image, he created both admiration and fear. The people adored him. The Senate feared him. And as his honors grew, so too did whispers of conspiracy. By 45 BCE, Julius Caesar had risen higher than any Roman before him. He was dictator for life, the master of armies, the architect of reforms, and the most celebrated man in the Republic. To the people, he was a hero who brought stability after decades of chaos. To many senators, however, he was a tyrant in all but name. And as his power grew, so too did whispers of conspiracy. The Roman Republic had been built on the principle that no man could hold absolute authority. Magistracies were temporary, power was shared, and tradition kept ambition in check. But Caesar had shattered those limits. His face appeared on coins. His statues stood alongside those of gods. He wore the laurel wreath and purple robe, as if he were already a monarch. Honors piled upon honors, granted by a senate that feared to resist. Some hailed him as a king in all but title. For Rome, a city that prided itself on having expelled kings centuries earlier, this was intolerable. The breaking point came in subtle moments that revealed how far Caesar had risen above his peers. Once, during a festival, he was offered a diadem, the symbol of monarchy. The crowd reacted with unease. Caesar refused it, knowing the Roman hatred for kingship, but the gesture left doubts. Was the refusal genuine, or was it theatre? Did Caesar secretly desire the crown? His enemies were convinced that he did. Among the Senate, resentment simmered. Many had accepted his clemency after the civil war, restored to their positions and wealth. Yet clemency itself became a source of humiliation. To live at Caesar's mercy was to live as subjects, not equals. Some began to see assassination not as treachery but as salvation, the only way to restore the Republic's dignity. The conspiracy coalesced around men of standing, including Gaius Cassius Longinus, a shrewd and embittered senator, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man torn between loyalty to Caesar and devotion to the Republic. Brutus was especially symbolic. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had led the revolt that expelled Rome's last king, Tarquin the Proud. For many conspirators, Brutus's participation would give their plot legitimacy, a return to Rome's founding ideals. Yet the conspirators were divided in motives. Some feared Caesar's power, others envied his glory, and still others resented being overshadowed. What united them was the conviction that Caesar had crossed a line. They whispered of monarchy, of dynasties, of Caesarion in Egypt. They imagined a future where the Republic was reduced to a puppet of one man and his heirs. Meanwhile, Caesar seemed unaware, perhaps unconcerned about the growing danger. He believed in his own fortune, convinced that destiny protected him. He dismissed omens and ignored warnings. He trusted too much in the clemency he had shown, assuming it had purchased loyalty. What he failed to see was that mercy does not erase ambition or fear. It only masks it until the moment comes to strike. The tension deepened in early 44 BCE, when the Senate prepared to grant Caesar even greater honors. He was to be worshipped as a living god, his statue placed in temples. The more honors he accepted, the more isolated he became. The senators no longer saw him as a colleague, but as a master. Even his friends began to worry that his ambition had no end. And yet, for all the danger, Caesar continued with his plans. He prepared for a grand campaign against Parthia, envisioning new conquests that would rival even Alexander the Great. He saw the future not as a limit, but as a horizon, waiting to be claimed. The conspirators, however, saw it differently. They believed that if Caesar departed for Parthia with his legions, he would never return as a mere Roman citizen. He would come back as a king or, perhaps, never relinquish power at all. Thus, the decision was made. Caesar, they concluded, must die. The Republic could be saved only through his removal. The Ides of March, March 15th of 44 BCE, loomed as the chosen day. The Senate would meet, Caesar would attend, and daggers would finish what politics could not. The seeds of conspiracy had been planted long before, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, when he wore the laurel wreath, when he accepted honors that no Roman had ever dared. Now those seeds bore fruit in the minds of men who called themselves liberators. For Caesar, destiny had always favored boldness. For his enemies, destiny demanded sacrifice. The clash was inevitable. As the spring of 44 BCE approached, Julius Caesar stood at the pinnacle of power. Dictator for life, master of Rome's armies, and architect of sweeping reforms, he seemed invincible. Yet, as the Ides of March drew near, whispers of doom surrounded him. Ancient Rome was a city steeped in superstition, and the weeks leading to his death were filled with omens, prophecies, and warnings that seemed to foreshadow the catastrophe. The people of Rome murmured about strange signs. Accounts tell of unusual weather, lightning storms, and mysterious apparitions. A soothsayer reportedly warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. On another occasion, Sacrificial animals were found to have missing hearts or malformed organs interpreted as ill omens by priests. Such signs unsettled many, but Caesar, ever confident in his destiny, dismissed them. He believed himself favored by fortune, protected by the gods. Even his wife, Calpurnia, was troubled by dark premonitions. On the eve of March 15th, she dreamed of Caesar's statue bleeding, while Romans washed their hands in the crimson stream. Terrified, she begged him not to attend the Senate meeting scheduled for the next day. Caesar, shaken by her pleas, initially agreed to stay home. He was not blind to her fears, and he valued her counsel. But the conspirators were determined, and fate was not so easily avoided. That morning, Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's trusted allies, but secretly part of the conspiracy, arrived at his house. He mocked the idea of dreams and omens controlling Caesar's actions. Was the great conqueror of Gaul to be swayed by superstition? Decimus urged him to attend the Senate, reminding him that important matters awaited and that absence would be seen as weakness. Flattered and persuaded, Caesar changed his mind. He decided to go. As Caesar prepared to leave, he encountered the soothsayer who had once warned him. "The Ides of March have come," Caesar declared with a smile. The soothsayer replied gravely, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." The words lingered, a final warning unheeded. The conspirators, meanwhile, were ready. Around 60 senators had pledged themselves to the plot. Led by Cassius and Brutus, they had planned carefully, hiding their daggers beneath their togas. The Senate meeting was chosen because no soldiers would be allowed inside, leaving Caesar vulnerable. They feared his upcoming campaign in Parthia would make him untouchable. If Caesar left Rome with his legions, he might return as a king. They believed the Ides of March was their last chance to act. As Caesar walked through the streets toward the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting, the city seemed tense. Supporters hailed him, but shadows lurked behind their cheers. He rode in a litter, surrounded not by legions, but by a small escort. For Caesar trusted his status, and clemency had secured loyalty. He did not see that mercy had instead bred resentment, that men he had spared now carried blades meant for his heart. At the theatre, senators rose to greet him. The chamber was filled with expectation, some looking forward to debate, others to bloodshed. Caesar, confident as ever, took his seat on the golden chair reserved for the dictator. He was at ease, unaware that destiny was closing in. The omens, the dreams, the warnings all had pointed to this moment. Yet Caesar, bold and unshaken, chose to ignore them. For a lifetime, fortune had rewarded his daring. He had crossed rivers, toppled kingdoms, and defied the Senate itself. Why should he fear whispers of doom now? The Ides of March had come. The trap was set. The greatest man in Rome was about to face his fate. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar entered the Senate meeting at the theatre of Pompey. The air was heavy with anticipation. Senators crowded the chamber, some eager for routine debates, others concealing daggers beneath their togas. Around 60 men had conspired together, bound by the belief that Caesar's death was the only way to preserve the Republic. Caesar, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe the depth of betrayal around him, took his seat in the Curia. He wore the laurel wreath that had become his symbol, a mark of his triumphs, but also a reminder of his growing resemblance to a king. For many of the senators present, this was the very image they had come to destroy. The conspirators had arranged their plan with precision. They would surround Caesar under the pretense of presenting petitions, then strike swiftly before his supporters could react. At a signal from Cassius, they approached. One conspirator, Julius Caesar, stepped forward, pleading for the recall of his exiled brother. He grasped Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his shoulders as if in desperate supplication. Caesar, startled by the breach of decorum, pushed him away. It was the signal. The first dagger flashed. Publius Ceruleus Casca struck from behind, his blade cutting Caesar's shoulder. Caesar turned, seizing Casca's arm and crying out, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" The chamber erupted into chaos as the other conspirators closed in. Blades pierced flesh in a frenzy. Cassius, Brutus, Decimus, and dozens of others thrust their daggers into Caesar's body. He struggled at first, fending off the attacks with remarkable strength for a man of 55. But the onslaught was overwhelming. His toga was slashed, his body struck again and again. Blood spattered the marble floor as senators once pardoned by his clemency drove steel into the man who had spared their lives. According to tradition, Caesar received 23 wounds. Some blows were shallow, but others pierced deep. He staggered, trying to resist, until his eyes fell upon Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus, whom Caesar had trusted like a son, raised his dagger and struck. In that moment, Caesar's strength failed. Ancient writers recorded different versions of his final words. Some claimed he said nothing, pulling his toga over his head in dignity as he fell. Others wrote that he whispered words of heartbreak to Brutus. Et tu, Brute. You too, Brutus. Whether spoken or imagined, the phrase became immortal, symbolizing ultimate betrayal. Caesar collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling beneath the marble likeness of his former ally turned rival. The symbolism was chilling. Pompey, in death, seemed to watch over the downfall of the man who had defeated him. The chamber echoed with shouts, confusion, and the sound of steel striking flesh. When it was over, Caesar's lifeless body lay on the Senate floor, pierced by the blades of men who called themselves liberators. The conspirators, their daggers dripping red, raised them high as if in triumph. They had slain the dictator. They believed they had restored the Republic. But outside the theatre, the people of Rome waited in confusion. They heard rumors of violence, of Caesar struck down, but they did not cheer. For many citizens, Caesar was not a tyrant but a benefactor, the man who had given them land, food, and games. The conspirators had expected to be hailed as heroes. Instead, fear and uncertainty spread through the streets. Inside, Caesar's body remained, abandoned by those who had once bowed before him. His blood stained the Senate floor, a crimson mark that no cleansing could erase. Rome's greatest man, conqueror of Gaul, victor of Pharsalus, lover of Cleopatra, dictator for life, was gone. The Ides of March had claimed him. The Republic's fate now hung in the balance, trembling between the dreams of the conspirators and the will of the Roman people. When Julius Caesar's body fell lifeless to the floor of the Senate on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, the conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. They raised their daggers high, declaring themselves liberators, the liberators of Rome. They expected the people to cheer, the Senate to rejoice, and the Republic to be restored. But instead of triumph, Caesar's death unleashed chaos. The conspirators emerged from the theatre of Pompey with blood still on their hands, crying out that they had slain a tyrant. They marched through the streets, calling upon citizens to celebrate the restoration of liberty. But the people of Rome did not respond as expected. Instead of cheers, there was silence. Fear and confusion rippled through the city. To the common people, Caesar had not been a tyrant. He had been a benefactor. He had given them land, reduced their debts, provided feasts and games, and promised stability after years of civil war. To them, the senators were not heroes but murderers who had slain their champion. The Senate itself was divided. Some fled in terror, fearing that violence would spread. Others hesitated, uncertain whether to support the conspirators or to wait and see how the people would react. Even many senators who disliked Caesar were uneasy about the murder. It had been brutal, dishonorable, and destabilizing. The Republic was not restored, it was thrown into turmoil. Caesar's supporters, led by Mark Antony, his trusted lieutenant and co-consul, acted swiftly. Antony, who had narrowly escaped being killed himself, realized the danger of both immediate revenge and unchecked anarchy. He moved cautiously, negotiating with the conspirators to prevent further bloodshed. At the same time, he prepared to use Caesar's death to his advantage. The conspirators attempted to frame their act as a noble sacrifice. They insisted that they had not sought power but the salvation of Rome. They even granted Caesar a public funeral, believing it would show their good faith. This decision would prove disastrous. On the day of the funeral, the people of Rome gathered in vast numbers. Caesar's body was displayed, draped in a blood-soaked toga, pierced with 23 wounds. Mark Antony delivered the funeral oration, and with it, he changed the course of history. Antony spoke not as a politician, but as a mourner, presenting Caesar as a generous leader betrayed by those he had pardoned. He lifted Caesar's torn garments, showing the wounds, naming the conspirators responsible. He reminded the crowd of Caesar's will, which left money and land to the Roman people. The crowd, already mourning, erupted in grief and rage. The streets exploded into fury. Citizens rioted, seizing benches and torches, and used them to burn Caesar's body in the Forum, rather than in the official cremation grounds. The flames roared high, consuming not only the dictator's corpse, but the conspirators' hopes. The people turned on the assassins, hunting them down, burning their houses, and forcing them to flee for their lives. Brutus, Cassius, and the others escaped Rome, but their cause was lost. They had hoped to be hailed as saviors. Instead, they were despised as traitors. Their daggers had not restored the Republic, they had unleashed another civil war. Caesar's death also left a vacuum of power. Into this void stepped Antony and another figure who would soon reshape Rome. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir and great-nephew, later known as Augustus. Together and, eventually, against one another, they would wage new wars in Caesar's name, using his memory as a weapon. The shockwaves of the Ides of March spread far beyond Rome. In the provinces, governors and soldiers swore loyalty not to the Senate but to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra in Egypt grieved for her fallen ally and lover. Across the empire, people whispered that Caesar had been more than mortal, that his soul had ascended to the heavens. Soon, he would be officially deified, worshipped as a god of Rome. The conspirators had killed the man, but they could not kill his memory, his reforms, or his vision. Caesar's death marked the end of the Roman Republic, not its salvation. In slaying him, the senators had ensured the rise of a new order, one in which power would no longer be shared, but concentrated in the hands of emperors. The Ides of March was not the rebirth of liberty. It was the birth of empire. The Ides of March had removed Julius Caesar from the stage, but it had not restored the Roman Republic. Instead, his death left a vacuum of power that plunged Rome into further chaos. The senators, who called themselves liberators, believed they had slain a tyrant to save liberty. In reality, they had unleashed forces they could not control. Within months, Caesar's legacy would be claimed by men far more ruthless than they had anticipated, most notably his great-nephew and adopted son, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. Octavian was only 18 years old when news of Caesar's assassination reached him in Illyria. Few knew his name, and fewer still imagined he would rise to power. Yet Caesar had officially named him his heir in his will, adopting him as his son and leaving him vast wealth. With this inheritance, Octavian carried not only Caesar's fortune but his name. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. The young man understood immediately what it meant. He was not simply Octavian anymore, he was Caesar. Returning to Rome, Octavian moved with astonishing skill. Though inexperienced in politics and war, he possessed determination, intelligence, and the aura of Caesar's bloodline. He played the role of dutiful heir, honoring Caesar's memory and presenting himself as the champion of his legacy. To the veterans who had fought under Caesar, this was enough. They rallied to him, swearing loyalty not just to Octavian but to the name of Caesar. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and co-consul, initially underestimated him. Antony believed the boy could be controlled or ignored. But Octavian quickly proved otherwise. He challenged Antony politically, aligned himself with the Senate when convenient, and gradually built his own power base. Within 2 years, Rome was divided not between republic and tyranny, but between Antony and Octavian, each claiming to be the true heir of Caesar's legacy. The turning point came with the formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE, an official alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. Unlike Caesar's informal pact with Pompey and Crassus, this triumvirate was granted absolute power by law. Together, they launched a campaign of brutal proscriptions, hunting down enemies, confiscating wealth, and executing rivals. Cicero, the great orator who had once denounced Antony, was among those slain. The liberators, Brutus and Cassius, were pursued to Greece, where they met their end at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Caesar's assassins, who claimed to have restored liberty, were defeated in Caesar's name. With their deaths, the Republic's fate was sealed. Rome was no longer a state governed by senatorial debate, but a battleground for strongmen wielding Caesar's legacy as their weapon. Antony aligned himself with Cleopatra in Egypt, presenting himself as a new Dionysus and dreaming of Eastern glory. Octavian, meanwhile, presented himself as the defender of traditional Roman values, the protector of Italy, and the rightful heir of Caesar. The rivalry culminated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's forces crushed Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives, and Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. In 27 BCE, he accepted the title Augustus, becoming the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead. In its place stood the Roman Empire. Octavian owed his rise entirely to Julius Caesar. Without Caesar's name, wealth, and soldiers, he might have remained an obscure noble. With them, he built a dynasty. He presented himself as the fulfillment of Caesar's vision, the man who brought peace after decades of war. Yet, in truth, Octavian surpassed his adoptive father. Where Caesar had ruled as dictator, Augustus crafted the illusion of republican institutions, cloaking monarchy in tradition. His empire endured for centuries, reshaping the Mediterranean world. The rise of Octavian marked the final stage of Caesar's legacy. The Republic, which Caesar had undermined, was now gone forever. In its place stood an empire that bore his name. Generations to come would call their rulers Caesar not just in Rome, but in lands as far away as Germany, Kaiser, and Russia. Thus, the end of Julius Caesar's life was not the end of his story. Through Octavian, his blood, his name, and his vision lived on, transforming Rome into something greater than any republic, an empire that would dominate history. In the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, his presence did not fade, it grew. Death transformed him from a mortal ruler into something far greater. A god, a symbol, and a myth that shaped the Roman world for centuries. For the people of Rome, Caesar's life had been extraordinary, but his death elevated him to the realm of immortality. The process began almost immediately. At his funeral, Mark Antony's speech had ignited the crowd, and the sight of Caesar's blood-stained toga had stirred grief and rage. The citizens built a pyre in the forum itself, cremating his body in defiance of tradition. In the days that followed, they constructed a monument at the site, turning it into a place of pilgrimage. Caesar, once dictator, had become a martyr in the eyes of the people. Then came the comet. In July of 44 BCE, during the games held in Caesar's honor, a brilliant star blazed across the sky for 7 days. Romans believed it was Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens. Poets and politicians alike seized on the omen, declaring that Caesar had been welcomed among the gods. He was officially consecrated as Divus Julius Davine Julius. Rome had seen generals and heroes deified after death, but never before had a Roman politician been raised so quickly and universally to divine status. The cult of Caesar spread rapidly. Temples were dedicated in his name, priests appointed to his service. His image appeared not only on coins but in shrines and ceremonies. People swore oaths by his divinity, and his memory became intertwined with Rome's destiny. For the common people, worshipping Caesar was both religious and political, way of honoring the leader who had given them land, grain, and hope. For ambitious men like Octavian, it was a tool of power. Octavian, Caesar's heir, used the deification of his adoptive father to strengthen his own position. As the son of a god, Divi Filius, he claimed divine legitimacy for his rule. The comet, the temples, and the cult all reinforced his authority. When he defeated Antony and Cleopatra and became Augustus, the first emperor, his power rested not only on military victory but on the sacred aura of being Caesar's son. Caesar's divinity had given birth to a dynasty. The image of Caesar as a god was carefully cultivated. Statues depicted him with the features of Jupiter or Apollo. In literature, he was compared to Hercules and Alexander the Great. His calendar reform tied him to the order of the cosmos, aligning time itself with his vision. Even his name, Caesar, became a title synonymous with rulership. Later, emperors bore it with pride, and in distant lands, it would echo as Kaiser and Tsar. But Caesar's myth was not purely divine. It was also political. To some, he remained a tyrant whose ambition destroyed the republic. To others, he was a savior who had brought order out of chaos. This duality, tyrant and god, destroyer and savior, ensured his memory was never simple. He embodied both the greatness and the fragility of Rome. In art and culture, Caesar's assassination became one of the most powerful symbols of betrayal. The image of Brutus striking down his benefactor captured the eternal conflict between loyalty and liberty, ambition and friendship. Playwrights, poets, and historians returned to the Ides of March again and again, turning Caesar's death into a timeless lesson on power. For the Roman people, however, it was not the conspirators who endured in memory, but Caesar himself. The men who killed him faded into exile and disgrace. Caesar, by contrast, was worshipped as a god, his name invoked in prayers, his image revered in temples. Death had not destroyed him, it had enshrined him forever in the heart of Rome. The transformation of Caesar from man to myth illustrates the power of memory in shaping history. He was no longer just a general, a politician, or a dictator. He was Divus Julius, the divine figure whose legacy outshone the Republic itself. And in this transformation lay the foundation of empire. Rome would no longer be ruled by men who shared power, but by emperors cloaked in Caesar's aura, men who claimed divine sanction to rule the world. The life of Julius Caesar ended on the Ides of March, but his legacy has never died. Across 2,000 years, his name, his deeds, and his vision have echoed through history. To study Caesar is to confront not only the story of Rome, but the story of power itself, its glory, its dangers, and its enduring allure. In Rome, his legacy was immediate and profound. The republic he helped to destroy was gone forever. In its place rose the Roman Empire, ruled by emperors who carried his name. Augustus, his heir, styled himself as the son of a god and built a system of government that disguised monarchy beneath republican forms. Every emperor who followed bore the title Caesar, a constant reminder that the empire was born from Julius's life and death. His reforms, colonies, citizenship, calendar, and administration endured, shaping the empire for centuries. Beyond Rome, Caesar became a model for rulers and conquerors. Medieval kings looked to him as the archetype of authority, a man who bent the world to his will. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered his writings, especially the commentaries on the Gallic War, studying his clarity, logic, and style. His works became classics not only of history but of literature, admired for their precision and elegance. The very word Caesar transcended time and place. In Germany, it became Kaiser. In Russia, it became Tsar. Both titles signified emperors who sought to inherit Rome's mantle. Centuries after his death, men who never saw Rome still claimed Caesar as their ancestor in power. His name became a synonym for rulership, a symbol of supreme authority. Artists and writers found endless inspiration in his story. Shakespeare's tragedy, Julius Caesar, immortalized his assassination, turning the Ides of March into a symbol of betrayal and fate. Painters depicted his triumphs, his death, and his crossing of the Rubicon. Philosophers debated his ambition. Was he a tyrant who destroyed liberty, or a visionary who created order? His life became a mirror in which every age saw its own struggles with power and freedom. Modern leaders, too, have invoked Caesar. Napoleon studied him obsessively, seeing in him a model of conquest and governance. Generals and statesmen across the world have drawn lessons from his strategies, his boldness, and his charisma. Even today, military academies teach his campaigns as examples of discipline, adaptability, and daring. Yet Caesar's legacy is not without warning. His rise demonstrated the fragility of republics, the ease with which ambition can topple institutions. His assassination showed the futility of violence without vision. The conspirators killed the man, but not the system he had created. His story is both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, reminding us that power concentrated in one man's hands can bring greatness, but also peril. In culture, language, and politics, Caesar's shadow remains. We mark our years by the Julian calendar he reformed. We speak of crossing the Rubicon when we make irreversible choices. We remember the Ides of March as a warning that even the mightiest can fall. His very name's his aura still carries weight, evoking empire, authority, and destiny. Perhaps this is the greatest legacy of Julius Caesar. He became timeless. More than a general, more than a dictator, more than a god, he became a symbol of ambition itself. He embodies the eternal tension between liberty and order, between the republic and empire, between human limits and the pursuit of greatness. From the Senate floor where he fell, to the emperors who bore his name, to the playwrights, rulers, and thinkers who drew inspiration from his life, Caesar has never truly left us. His rise and fall continue to resonate because they speak to something universal. The drive to shape history, to seize power, to grasp at immortality. In the end, Julius Caesar achieved what few mortals ever have. He conquered nations, reshaped Rome, and defied the Republic. But above all, he conquered time. His story endures, not only in history books, but in every age that grapples with the meaning of power. The man is gone. The empire he inspired has fallen. But the legend of Caesar, his name, his ambition, his destiny, lives on.